Good. Anthea, you're gonna go over this with us. I was told this is here because there's a financial impact on, which is why the Secretary of the Senate made sure he told me that, so we wouldn't be saying why we got this bill.
I will also say why you have it, and then I will defer the balance of questions on the fiscal impact to Chris.
That's our area.
Okay, so for the record. Oh, you are live.
We are live.
So for the record, Anthea Dixter Cooper from the Office of Legislative Counsel. So I'm going to put the bill up on the screen so that you all have it.
Okay.
And while I'm doing that, I'm going to tell you the big picture of this bill is actually in final reading yesterday. So if you saw that, you have the sneak peek of what this bill does. So under current law, your license can be suspended for a number of reasons based on your driving history, such as the accumulation of points. If you get a DUI, certain driving infractions yield an automatic suspension. Your license can also be suspended for the non-payment of child support. That's a federal requirement. And your license can be suspended for the non-payment of a moving violation. That would be a traffic violation for which points are assessed. It used to be, prior to 2016, that your license could also be suspended for the non-payment of any traffic violation. So if you got a ticket because your tail light was out and you didn't pay it, your license could be suspended.
In that, I was on judiciary, and the number of people driving for non-payment of fines with license suspended was staggering. And this committee has a certain amount of guilt, and since Senator McDonald and I are the only ones that have been here since the beginning, we will accept it. But for a while, when an organization, a good organization, needed to raise money, and there was the least bit connection, the suggestion was what you just put a $2 surcharge on a traffic offense. And the offense, the cost got so high that people didn't have the money, but they needed to get to work. And it could be for having your tail light broken or anything else. And it was not a good situation. The civil rights 2 years ago in Missouri, and the name is slipping, they had a whole history of targeting Black people with like $500 fines for not doing a full stop at a stop sign, and it ended up with people being jailed. Ferguson. It was systemic. I think we did it without realizing we were doing it. So.
Well, this is chipping away a little bit more at that. So this bill would eliminate the suspensions for the non-payment of the moving violations. So you already in 2016 got rid of the suspensions for the non-payment of the non-moving violations. This is the suspensions for the non-payment of the moving violations. Anything that you get a point for, and that's going to be something linked to driver behavior. The reason why the bill is here is because when your license is suspended, there is an $80 reinstatement fee. So if you're not suspending as many licenses, you're not collecting as many reinstatement fees, you're not collecting revenue to the state through reinstatement fees. What this bill doesn't do is it doesn't eliminate the state's ability to collect the money that is owed for those civil penalties. So if you owe $1,000 for your moving violation ticket, probably $1,197 with the fees and surcharges that are on it, you still have to pay that. This bill doesn't change anything about the ability for the Vermont Judicial Bureau to use a collection agency to get an offset from your tax return, to have it go to civil contempt proceedings if that's possible in the circumstances. But what it's doing is, from a fiscal perspective, is by not suspending the license, it's not collecting the reinstatement fee. That's the big picture. Do a walkthrough. It'll be super short because there's not much in the bill, because it only takes striking one subdivision to eliminate those suspensions. And I will preface all of this by saying this bill is 6 pages. The majority of it is technical corrections that you have already passed in the technical corrections bill that was on the floor for third reading yesterday.
Oh, okay, that was part of it, all right.
Some of this is included there. The first piece, and this is in subsection B, current subsection heading, just to assist the reader, says that this subsection covers suspensions for non-payment of certain traffic violation judgments. Since you'll be eliminating the suspensions for non-payment, you should amend the subsection heading accordingly. You now get to, and I'm going to put this up in unstruck form so you can read it a little easier, the main crux of this bill, which is striking out subdivision 2A. And what 2A says is, in the case of a judgment on a traffic violation for which the imposition of points against the person's driving record is authorized by law, you're moving violations. The judgment itself needs to contain a notice that failure to pay or otherwise satisfy the amount due within 30 days of the notice will, mandatory, result in suspension of the person's operator's license or privilege to operate, and that payment options are available. So it's requiring there to be notice of the fact that if you don't pay this moving violation, your license will be suspended. That's the notice piece. Second piece, if the defendant fails to pay the amount due within 30 days of the notice or by a later date determined by the Judicial Bureau, and the case is not pending on appeal, the Judicial Bureau needs to send notice to the Commissioner of Motor Vehicles. So then the sending of information from the Judicial Bureau over to the DMV. Final piece, if after 20 days it still hasn't been paid, the Commissioner shall, mandatory, suspend the person's license or privilege to operate. So you are eliminating the fact that people need to know about the possibility that their license will be suspended. You're eliminating the requirement that the Judicial Bureau tell the Commissioner that the ticket hasn't been paid, and you're eliminating the suspension itself. So striking out that paragraph, no more suspensions.
Has this been to judiciary?
It has.
Okay, so now, just, so you have to pay the penalty, but you don't lose your license.
Exactly.
My experience is parking tickets, but there are.
Not moving violation.
No, I know. That's why some of those college students had a backseat full of them till we got a boot. But if there is, you could conceivably have 3 violations in a short, it says, could, if this is your second and you haven't paid for your first and you're now in, could they put a penalty or a suspension on there?
Yeah, you have a lot of people who have multiple suspensions. So when you see the data that Chris is going to present, the total number of unique suspensions, the universe of people whose license is suspended for non-payment is smaller than the total number of suspensions.
Because you're driving to work, you haven't had the money, and you get, and it becomes a felony.
It does. After 3, within a 2-year period, it becomes a criminal driving with license suspended.
And there was, I know why 30,000, it was an unbelievable number of people driving with license suspended when we started trying. Because not being able to pay fine is not a crime.
Debtor's prison.
Yeah, debtors, I was thinking of debtors prison reform. Okay.
Okay, and I will tell you the end of my walkthrough was going to say this was voted out of Senate Judiciary 5-0, and they have a small amendment, which I will show you what it is. So you can see what it is. Okay, so this is
Just a question. Admittedly, I came in just a couple minutes late, so maybe I missed something. Does this basically say that someone can just simply ignore their fines forever and nothing happens?
Nope, there's a collection provision. Usually it's done with your tax refund is where they're collecting it. The Judicial Bureau also has the authority to contract with the collections agency and collect money that's owed through that. And there also is a civil contempt option, which I don't think is availed much.
So they can hire a collection agency, or if you have any taxes paid, and often folks are in this situation with multiple convictions because they haven't paid a traffic fine, don't have any tax refunds. So, I mean, as I read this, effectively, everybody's getting away scot-free. I won't ask you to, I won't ask you to
I
answer that.
appreciate that you're not asking me to answer that.
The Judiciary Committee has spoken on this, but
Yeah, but it's, the finance committee is looking at the revenue implications of this.
So you also missed me say that the fiscal impact, and not to take Chris's fiscal note away from him when he walks through that, the reason why this is thought to have a known fiscal impact to the state is because under current law, in order to reinstate your license after it has been suspended, in addition to paying whatever it is that you owe for the civil penalties themselves, you also have to pay an $80 reinstatement fee. So if
we're
we were,
doing away with that, right?
what?
What we're being asked is, do we do away with that?
So you're not doing away with the reinstatement fee, you're sort of acknowledging the fact that this change in not having as many suspensions will lead to about a $200,000 each year loss of revenue through those $80 reinstatement fees.
Okay, so if I drive with my license suspended and I get caught now, I get another set of, at some point, if I want to get my license reinstated, I have to have the money to pay the fines plus the $80.
So yes, you still owe the money for the civil penalty, but the length of the current suspension is 30 days, or if it's paid in full before 30 days. So under current law, your license is not suspended indefinitely for non-payment. It's suspended for 30 days, or until, if you pay it, you can have 30 days be shorter. So if you're thinking that this is a stick to make people pay, it is, but it's not like a full stick, because they're not forever suspended until they repay the money that's owed.
There's a question about moving violations. To confirm, that's stop signs, that's red lights, that's speeding. Is it also driving under the influence, Dewey's?
So driving under the influence is different. Your license can be suspended for sort of just that universe of infractions, because those are civil if you're refusing a breathalyzer, but it's a criminal piece. So this is more the speeding,
Is it defined anywhere what entails the moving violations?
A moving violation is defined in Title 23. I think the easiest way to know what a moving violation is if you look on the DMV, they have a code of violations. And if there is a 0, it is not a moving violation. If there is a 2 or above, it's a moving violation. So you can see anything that you could get cited for and whether or not it has points associated with it.
And I know when we did the original work, trying to get people reinstated, we specifically left out driving under the influence, driving with death or injury, but it was purely, if it wasn't for the money you hadn't paid, your record was essentially clean.
Yeah. And this doesn't change the suspensions for point accumulation, and it doesn't change the suspensions that's otherwise an automatic suspension under statute. The only thing that is changing is the non-payment piece. So you still theoretically could have your license suspended for accumulating 10 points, and your license will still be suspended for your driving behavior, just not for your not paying.
Okay.
So if I understand this correctly, that if a person has a license suspension as it exists right now, it's for a period of 30 days or until the amount due is satisfied, whichever is first. So if the person pays after 20 days, the license suspension goes away.
If they pay their $80 reinstatement fee.
Yeah, if on the other hand, they allow it to go 30 days and don't pay it, the license is no longer suspended.
And they need to pay their $80 reinstatement fee.
So the penalty is just paying the $80 reinstatement fee at that point,
But you still owe the money.
and you still owe the fine.
But your license wasn't, so what this would be doing in your scenario is you pay it 20 days, you don't pay until after 30 days.
Mhm.
The change is gonna be your license wasn't suspended for
So
those
you don't
30
pay
days.
the $80 reinstatement.
Exactly, because your license is never suspended, you never pay the $80 reinstatement fee, you do still owe.
And that's the reduction in the revenue, is the
So,
$80 fee.
This is under what's being proposed, is that it?
Right.
As opposed to right now, you regardless of when the license suspension is over, you still have to pay $8.
Yes, and the reason why you're not gonna have the collection of the state is not gonna have the collection of the $80 is because you're not having that suspension piece, so there's not such a reinstate.
Okay. Any other questions?
I
Do you
just-
want to go over the,
I'm just gonna point out two other small things. The language as it is currently in statute requires the Judicial Bureau to offer a payment plan option that allows an individual to avoid suspension. I think in practice, they're offering payment plans to everyone. There are requirements in statute that it can't be more than $30 per traffic violation or $100 per month, $30 per traffic violation per month, or $100 per month in total. That is just being clarified to say that they need to offer payment plan options to everyone, since there's no longer the avoid the suspension piece. And then there's just some clarifying language that says that there cannot be a civil contempt proceeding if the defendant is complying with the payment plan. I think you would not be able to show the grounds that need to be met for civil contempt if someone was complying with the payment plan, because there's a language about how you haven't paid anything. Final piece I'm going to point out is the implementation language in the bill as it was introduced. Section 2 and Section 3 were combined together, and it said that the bill took effect on passage and then provided sort of a line drawn in the sand. It's not changing anything for a suspension that's currently in effect, but going forward, there can't be any suspensions for non-payment. Senate Judiciary thought that that should be split, have the implementation language be in its own section. That's what you see here. So the Commissioner of Motor Vehicles shall not suspend any driver's licenses for privilege to operate that are not already suspended. So no change if your license is suspended as of the effective date of this act solely for the non-payment of a civil penalty. It could still be suspended for any of the other reasons that suspensions are allowed prior to the effective date of the act. So if it hasn't been suspended yet, it won't be suspended as of the effective date of the act. And the effective date of the act used to be in the version that left the House on passage. The DMV said that that would be administratively difficult, given that they send out those notices 20 days in advance before the license is actually suspended. So now it would take effect 30 days after passage. The other thing this bill doesn't do is it doesn't reinstate any licenses. So anyone whose license is suspended still didn't need to pay that $80 reinstatement fee.
First, collection of disclaimers. I understand this committee's jurisdiction is over the implications of the bill for the finances of the state. Okay, so we shouldn't be stepping into the Judiciary Committee's turf. That said, committees do that all the time. So I also have seen how people just dig themselves in deeper and deeper. And at times, what starts as a small mistake suddenly becomes a life-changing collapse. And I don't want to do that to people. Nevertheless, I want to understand what happens if I've got a fine. I did something that I shouldn't have done. Wasn't the end of the world, wasn't terrible, but nor was the penalty. Okay? I did something I shouldn't have done. There was a penalty. I didn't pay the penalty. Under this offense, what are the bad consequences I face?
So there could be the tax offset. There should be the a collection agency to try and collect from you. And you could theoretically have civil contempt proceedings against you. So those are the three things that exist under current law, and there is no change to those sort of tools the state has to recover the civil penalty under this bill. Nothing's being changed with respect to it. And I think you will hear from Chris, and if you wanted to have some of the subject matter witnesses that came in and testified in Senate Judiciary, there's plenty of information out there about what the state is currently doing and where they are sort of having the most success in collecting the civil penalties that are owed in the situations that you brought up.
any other questions? Okay, go on to Chris.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair,
Good afternoon.
members of the committee. My name is Chris Root from the Joint Fiscal Office. I think Anthea pretty much summed up what I was going to say in my fiscal note, but that won't stop me from reading it to you word for word. Just kidding. The highlights, as were mentioned, the top fiscal impact we expect to see from the legislation would be a loss of reinstatement fee revenue to the transportation fund, for the quite simple reason that if there are fewer licenses suspended, there are fewer reinstatement fees paid. The fiscal note has like 3 pages worth of commentary on how noisy the data is and how many caveats are around the data from year to year. But bottom line, just based on the proportion of suspensions, individual suspensions that are due solely to failure to pay amounts due within 30 days, relative to how much money we bring in from reinstatement fee revenue, we expect this would result in approximately $200,000 of loss of foregone revenue per year to the transportation fund. Despite what you all may have read in the news, I do not think that $200,000 is a pretty insignificant amount of money. It is more money than I am worth by far. But in the scope of a roughly $320 million a year transportation fund, it is pretty insignificant. It works out to be about 0.06 of 1% of the annual revenue. So it sort of amounts to a rounding error in the revenue projections. Some other things that I mentioned in much lesser impacts that are noted in the fiscal note is DMV expects to have relatively insignificant impact to their administrative operations as a result of the bill. They would expect to save some postage costs and some, costs associated with generating fewer suspension letters. But this isn't, processing these isn't any one person's sole job over there. A lot of the back end processes about the data exchange between the judiciary and DMV are automated on the back end. So it's not going to result in a massive change to their operations. The Judicial Bureau did note that they may have some one-time costs associated with reconfiguring that data exchange to sort of shut it off and to possibly reprint some tickets that had already been printed just to update the information on the back. But again, we're talking about several $1,000s of one-time costs, which are relatively small. One other item I flagged in here is just I really want to underscore and reiterate that notwithstanding the $80 reinstatement fee, this bill would not absolve anybody from the responsibility of paying the amounts otherwise due through their court fines and surcharges and the underlying penalty and what have you. But sort of one thing that I'd call a known unknown is whether or not any behavior would change as a result of the legislation, which could impact the timing of those payments. So if somebody, and this is something I very clearly don't speculate on, but say somebody who would otherwise have the financial ability to pay amounts due in full within 30 days, maybe some folks might enter a payment plan instead or things like that. We don't know what that impact would be. Again, it doesn't impact the total amount you're on the hook for paying. Could impact timing of payments to some of those court funds. So, if more of these have to go to the tax offset process, or, if people are paying $30 a month for a little more time, it could have some impacts on timing, but we just don't know yet. Something to pay attention to. But bottom line up front, bottom line to summarize is $200,000 roughly with a reasonable range of error from year to year.
Any questions?
Are there any offsets of monies that we spending under the present regime that we would be relieved of?
I'm sure I understand your question.
Well, we spend a certain amount of time enforcing. Costs money. Is it possible to ultimately go to jail? It is possible to go to jail. Eventually driving with a license.
It is if you have, I think, three or more instances of being caught driving with a suspended license, but we did hear the other committees did hear some testimony that given the diversion programs that are in place right now, there aren't, in practice, there aren't really a whole lot of people going to jail, quite frankly, for for these reasons, because there have been a lot of diversionary programs put in place, the payment plan availability has helped. But no, I think you're right that, you know, one of the rationales behind the bill is, you know, if the issue is people don't have the money to pay the amounts due within 30 days, does suspending somebody for not doing that hinder their ability to earn the money they need to pay what they owe? So I think that's really the sort of crux behind the bill.
And those diversion programs went in when we first started working on this as a way to help people that were out there driving with suspended license to work it out and develop a payment plan. And I think this is also part of not sending people to jail who aren't violent felons. They just frequently don't have the money to pay the fines. Okay. Questions, thoughts? I'm going to put this on tomorrow for a possible vote. Unless we want to hear from somebody else, we could ask somebody from judiciary to come in. But it's not an insignificant amount of money, but in the total picture. And it will help some people get right.
It's the only concern I have, it's just this gnawing concern that, yes, there's some people who can't afford to pay, and giving them a break and so on, it makes sense. We had breaks in terms of allowing people to sign up for extended payment plans and other kinds of mechanisms. But what about the person who just simply doesn't pay and could care less, who's snubbing their nose at the system? And there are people like that.
Oh,
And I just wonder, is this, you know, a gift?
maybe we will ask the reporter of the bill to come down and talk to us
Maybe
tomorrow.
there's some testimony or something else, but
Yeah,
you know, somebody essentially can snub their nose at the system and say, well, you know, you can't do anything to me. I'm not going to pay. You know, collection agency can't get any money from me. Go buzz off.
so maybe tomorrow, there are scofflaws. I mean, I'm not kidding. We had college students in this town with, cops were writing a ticket, you could look in the back seat, and the back seat was full of party tickets. Not quite the same severity as this. And maybe we probably should ask if Senator Sears can come in, because this has been one of those ongoing, step-by-step issues to get our jails down, and he would have the institutional memory to remind us how we got here. Anthea?
I didn't provide it to you because I know you're normally interested in the finance side of things, but I have a 2-page handout that does the history of the efforts that the General Assembly has done to address this, which I can send to Jill.
Yeah, if you send her Jill, she can get it out to all of us, that would be helpful. And then after that, we can decide if you want to have Senator Sears come in, would that work? Okay. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Got a point.
We are back, yes, we did get the yield bill. We found it, it wasn't lost, it just took 3 days to get here from the House chamber. And this is our second largest, it's probably the largest annual bill we do, is the property tax bill. And we're gonna start just going through it. A little different this year. We've got Michael O'Grady coming in. He is up there. I don't know, Michael, what's your time like? I know you're highly committed, and Abby, you're okay.
I am, I'm really good, actually. My 3 o'clock canceled.
Oh,
So I am good through 4 o'clock.
wow, okay. So maybe we'll let Abby walk us through. And then there's a couple things that are going on in this bill that We don't usually have Michael O'Grady for the yield bill, so we'll find out what is going on.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Would you like me to share my screen so I can show you the yield bill
Yeah,
language?
I think so, and I think that would be helpful if anyone is watching at home or, yep, Senator Ron Hinsdale. Watch it.
Great. For the record, Abby Shepherd, Office of Legislative Counsel. This is H492. It is posted on the committee's webpage under my name. So this is as passed by the House, and as Madam Chair, you just mentioned, the yields and the non-homestead rate are passed every year by the General Assembly, not necessarily in their own bill. Last year they were in their own separate bill. There were some other provisions that were included, but sometimes because it
Sometimes
is
it's
just
on
one
miscellaneous
section.
tax, sometimes it's frequently miscellaneous tax.
Or a overall sort of education fund property revenue bill. So this particular bill is quite short because it has the homestead property tax yield language, and it has a second section that sets aside a reserve, and then it has the effective dates. So I'll just walk you through this language that is what you see more or less every year, except it's set for a different fiscal year. But to give you a bit of background, there are the yields are defined in statute. So that is how you set the homestead property tax rate. The yields are adjusting for education spending. And then you have the non-homestead rate that is a set dollar rate in statute. So there is that sort of default, which is $1.59 is the default non-homestead rate. A couple of years ago, there was a default homestead yield put into statute, which makes it the prior year's homestead yields unless the General Assembly acts through session law, which is what this bill would do. So it's saying the General Assembly is taking action to set the yields, one for the property dollar equivalent yield, so that's for individuals who are paying based on the value of their home, and the other, and that's at $15,477. And then the second yield is the income dollar equivalent yield. So that's for property taxpayers who are paying based on their income and the value of their home. And that's where that complicated property tax credit calculation comes in, which I will get into detail on unless you'd like me to dive into that. And that is being set at $17,577. So those are for the yields. And then the pursuant to language is that what I was just mentioning, the default would be last year's yields if you didn't set this language. So pursuant to that, you are choosing to set a yield different from last year. Yields, plural. And then notwithstanding the current statutory $1.59 for non-homestead, this language would set the non-homestead rate, so that's the statewide rate, at $1.388 for every $100 of equalized education property value. And again, just a refresher, the CLA will then apply to the town's actual tax rate. So while I say this is a statewide non-homestead rate, it will be adjusted by the CLA. That is sort of the standard language that is updated each year, and you choose. So again, you have the December 1st letter. That gives you sort of a formulaic sort of bureaucratic calculation based on how much revenue is in the education fund versus what you would need to set property tax rates at to raise enough to meet education spending. And then this is the General Assembly's discretion to actually set the yields and the non-homestead rate.
I think the December 1st letter was set up so that voters and school boards had an idea as to if they voted, because we wait until the administrations have submitted their proposed budgets. They haven't been finalized, but it goes out so that local school boards and local voters know relatively what the consequences will be if they vote the anticipated X%. And then we come in and set the yield based on, there's a few school districts that are not voting until now, or maybe May. But most of them vote in March. And so this is the yield based on the actual.
Based on that, and I will let Julia walk you through the education fund outlook, but there are also other proposals in bills, which is why Michael O'Grady is here to speak to you about a different bill that would have an impact on the education fund, which in turn, I'll let Julia speak to whether that impacts the yields or not, but what you're seeing for these numbers has those proposals already baked in.
Okay. So we will let Michael talk. You've got more.
Yes, I have one more, sorry. And part of that, what I'm saying is baked into these yields and rate, non-homestead rate, is a proposal from the House that was passed out in this bill to set aside in this fiscal year $22 million within the education fund. So in addition to the existing stabilization reserve, the stabilization reserve is up to 5%. So this 22 million is set aside and it's dedicated to offsetting fiscal year 25, so next year's any property tax rate increases. So that 22 million would offset, and it has this second sentence starting on line 8, where it requires the Commissioner of Taxes in the December 1st letter to assume that that 22 million would buy down property tax rates. And then in the final sentence, really just belts and suspenders language saying this is, paying the property tax credit, setting property tax rates. Those are all education fund expenditures and related to education fund purposes, and those are allowed under the ed fund statute. And like, I think pretty much every yield and rate bill that I've ever seen, it's always a July 1st. So it's for fiscal year 24. So it could take effect on passage, or the effective date can be July 1st, because irrespective of the bill effective date, it's for fiscal year 24.
Okay, and I think we'll like Representative Kornheiser to come down and share why her committee did this. Okay,
She would be best placed to speak to the
Yes.
policy.
I know she's done a lot of work on this.
Yes.
Some
So
of it came out of some of the education on income tax discussions, got her thinking, so we'll take a look at it.
my piece on this is pretty limited to what the yield bill is, but I'd be happy to take questions and be on the sideline if you have questions on this. But again, there are several other bills that impact the numbers you see here.
Yes.
So I'm new to this committee, I don't want to waste everybody's time, but I'd love any background on how that yield number came to be. So what testimony the
The
House
short
took.
thing is, we didn't like being blamed for setting the tax rate. So we set the yield, which results in the tax rate.
This is like what went into that number.
Okay, it's basically,
Do you want the actual calculation? Because I think Julie will talk about that, but in terms of just would remind everyone that the ed fund is sort of the flip of the general fund. So rather than spending based on the revenues that are coming into the general fund, there's the education spending decisions that are made locally, and then the yields and tax rate take that into account, in addition to the other funds that are available from tax revenues, for example, sales and use tax that are going into the education fund. And I don't want to go into too much detail about that because Julie is really the best place to explain how these, the 15,000 and the 17,000, how those numbers were arrived at. One thing to note, and I'm sure Julie will mention this as well, but the higher the yields, the lower the rate.
okay,
I will.
it's just a different way of expressing the same thing. How much money any of the tax rate raises.
And there's the ed fund outlook is very useful for comparing all of the different years and projections and everything that's coming in and going out.
Okay. We ready to go on? Okay, Michael?
I am going to share my screen.
Okay, good. Okay. we
Okay,
got-
can you see my screen?
Yes,
So I'm going to talk to you about school construction, but the aspect of H486 that addresses or impacts the education fund, it also relates to the existing requirement for A&R to conduct indoor air quality testing of schools for the presence of polychlorinated biphenyls, PCBs. In section 1, you may be aware that there was a bill S-124 that came out of your Senate Ed Committee that would have created a construction aid task force to evaluate and report on issues relating to school construction. The membership of that committee is largely the same in H-486 as it was in S-124 out of the Ed Committee. There's members of the House of Representatives, members of the Senate, the State Treasurer, Secretary of Ed, Executive Director of the NEA, Executive Director of the Vermont Principals Association, Executive Director of the School Boards Association, Superintendents Association, Municipal Bond Bank, President of Vermont School Custodians and Maintenance, a person with expertise in historic preservation, a person with expertise in construction for schools, and a member of the American Industrial Hygiene Association. A member that was not an S-124 out of the Education Committee was the state toxicologist from the Department of Health. And her participation is relevant to the powers and duties of the task force. So the task force reviews the statewide school facilities inventory that was required under Act number 72, 2021, and studies the following issues: the needs, programmatic and health and safety of statewide school construction funding options for statewide school construction, governance structure, and then why the state toxicologist is involved is the appropriate state action level for response to PCB contamination in a school, and whether the state should continue to require the testing of indoor air quality in schools for PCBs. Now, the task force has the assistance of the Agency of Ed, the Department of Health, and the Office of State Treasurer, and they can also contract for further assistance for school construction and then administrative, technical, financial, or legal assistance. They report back to you on or before January 15th, 2024, with any recommendations for legislative action, including a recommendation on how the state should expend the funding in the Ed Fund reserved for future school construction. The rest of it is largely the technical stuff you see in task force and study committees: who's going to chair, when they start, when they end, who gets compensation. There's also, however, a $200,000 appropriation to the Office of State Treasurer to retain any administrative, technical, financial, legal, or construction experts that were authorized under the assistance section in subdivision D2. So that is the first section of 486, the School Construction Aid Task Force. I'm going to stop there and see if anyone has any questions.
okay, and is this presently in Senate? This came out of the Ag Committee?
No, it came out of the Ed Committee. It came out of
Ed,
Senate,
okay.
Senate Education.
That makes more sense. So,
I just walked through H486 with Senate Education. They indicated that S-124 is in Senate appropriations and that it is intended to be included in the appropriations bill when the Senate Appropriations Committee moves the big bill out.
okay, why is it relevant to the yield bill?
It's relevant to the education fund, partly because they're going to recommend spending from the education fund for school construction, but also because under section 2, H486 would pause the current testing of indoor air quality for PCBs. You may all remember, and maybe some of you weren't not here then, but in 2021, Act number 74, which was an appropriations bill, the Agency of Natural Resources was directed to test indoor air quality of schools for PCBs. But this bill would direct ANR to not initiate testing in schools in the state after the effective date of the act until the report of the School Construction Aid Task Force required by Section 1 has been submitted and the General Assembly approves further PCB testing. So testing that was required in 2021 would pause. School Construction Aid Task Force submits its report and the General Assembly has to further act in order to reinitiate PCB testing. And if ANR has initiated on-site testing, they actually have the monitoring equipment in a school prior to the effective date of the act, this act, then ANR shall complete that testing. And then if there's cost for removal or remediation, say the school's action levels was exceeded, then they apply for a grant from the Agency of Education from the Education Fund. And then in addition, at the end of fiscal year 2023, any funds remaining from the appropriation to ANR in Act 74, which was $4.5 million, that would revert to the Education Fund to be held in reserve for future school construction needs as recommended by the School Construction Aid Task Force.
Okay. And my,
Now, I'm not done. We got another $32.5 million to deal with. And so that is in sub B. In the yield bill in 2022, you appropriated $32.5 million. But you didn't really appropriate it. You reserved it in the ed fund, right? You reserved it in the ed fund in the yield bill, 32.5 million for purposes of investigation, remediation, and removal of PCBs. You then appropriated 2.5 million to the emergency board to deal with any exigent issues that ANR might have in their testing program. So what you are doing is unreserving the money, the 29 million that was reserved in the ed fund, and then you're calling back the 2.5, whatever unexpended portion of the 2.5 that you gave to the emergency board. And you will see that that money goes into the ed fund for one or more of the following purposes. So that 29 plus is going to be used for a grant program at the Agency of Education. The first categories of grants are to those schools that are currently doing testing but haven't had to do any removal or remediation yet. If they are required to do removal or remediation, AOE will give them a grant to cover 100% of the remediation or removal costs, including costs incurred when necessary under state or federal law to relocate students to a facility during remediation or removal. And then under sub B, since there are schools that have already done removal and remediation, but only received 80% of their cost and reimbursement from ANR, you are making those schools whole by providing for a grant to those schools to reimburse any costs that ANR did not pay them under the ANR program. And then last, you're giving a grant of up to $16 million to the Burlington School District to reimburse the school district for costs of demolition and removal of PCB contamination at Burlington High School. As I just explained to your Senate Education Committee, the Burlington number is there because you're making the other schools 100% whole for their costs of remediation and removal. And Burlington's costs of remediation and removal were in part due to a lower state action level. And so it's a concept of equity of making Burlington whole as you are making those other schools whole.
okay. Help me.
One last thing. in order to provide some cost containment on the grants and what is eligible, the Secretary of Ed consults with specified stakeholders to come up with criteria for the costs that will be eligible for a grant. So a school can't, go buy the 4-pane Scandinavian windows to replace their school windows that had PCB contamination in them. There will be limitations on what will be eligible for reimbursement.
Okay, so what we're doing, and just a little history, there was a school facilities study that still hasn't come in, right? It's due in October, and last year, the other body did not want to put any money aside for PCB test or for remediation. This committee finally negotiated it, got that money set aside. Because living with PCBs is proven to be dangerous. This says we're gonna stop the testing. So I guess if we don't know, we're not liable. And we're going to make the schools we've tested whole. They're not gonna pay anything. And we're not gonna do anything else until there's another study.
Until there's a study, a recommendation from that task force, and further legislative action to restart PCB testing.
We don't have this bill, right? It's with Senate Ed.
It's in Ed, but the ramifications are here. If we put the money in, they have an issue. But yeah, this has got a lot. I mean, to me, if I were a parent and it was possible that my kid was breathing poisoned air, and the state said, well, we're not gonna test it, what if the school pays for the testing? And don't we have contracts for this testing? I was told we had 5 engineering companies that were doing the testing. Are we just telling them now, forget it, and you're gonna?
So under the state contracting procedures in the administrative bulletin, there's a standard term and condition that says, it's called the non-appropriation clause. It says if a contract at the end of a fiscal year is not funded to go forward into the subsequent fiscal year, then the agency is directed or has authority to terminate that contract. And what you do in 486 is you defund the testing. A&R doesn't have money to do testing anymore, and then you direct them to terminate that contract under the non-appropriations clause. It's usually when states interfere with contracts, it's an issue under the U.S. Constitution Contracts Clause. But here, because of administrative bulletin, you have built-in authority to terminate this contract due to lack of appropriation.
Okay, but next year or the year after, when we decide we want to continue that contracting, we've got 5 engineering firms that are probably royally annoyed at us and might not want to, and we would lose a certain amount of expertise. I mean, to just start, they started in good faith. There was no indication that we were going to cut back on this. I thought there was an appropriation when because Approach set up this testing.
Yes, there was 4.5 million set up for testing.
And so where is that going? We're just not gonna figure it out?
That's going to be used, but whatever is unexpended at the end of the fiscal year is going to go back into the education fund for purposes of school construction.
I don't know that it came out of the education fund to start with. I thought it was an appropriation. It happened. None of us knew about it. I don't think it could have come out of the education fund if this committee didn't know about it. I think it was general fund money.
I think you're correct, but that doesn't mean you can't put that money into the education fund.
I think Senator Kitchell might have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, obviously. I was gonna say, I can't remember, I had a train of thought that I just lost.
All right. Happens to the best of us. Okay,
I share your concern. I remember this conversation last year, and I'm hesitant and not supportive of pausing the testing. But my question might be more on how this affects this bill. Do you know how the $16 million came, where that figure comes from? Is it just half of the 32 million, or is there some other calculation as to how they arrived at that allocation for Burlington?
The Burlington School District Superintendent brought in a cost estimate, kind of a line by line, with this 16 million being one of those lines, and the estimate of what it will cost for removal and remediation, demolition and removal, I should say.
in Chittenden County.
I'd love to see that.
Yeah, we'll see. Okay. All right, and we are also setting a precedent here of making schools whole, which means going forward, it's going to be harder to say to town, we are going to make you whole, we will help you. Even in school construction, we didn't cover all the costs. Not having the testing, not knowing what the cost might be, that also, once you pay Burlington what Burlington said it costs and make the other schools whole, then you said, how are you gonna say to the next town, well, we're only gonna pay 50% of your costs, and sorry, we aren't gonna pay anything. I think that's got some challenges. Okay, thank you. We will have a nice talk with the Education Committee, I'm sure, before this is done. All right. Committee, any other questions for Mr. O'Grady? Okay, so Julia, wanna show us where this plays out in our ed fund forecast?
Yes. Hey, good afternoon, Lee Richard, Fiscal Office. So, what would you like? Would you like me to pull up the Ed Fund Outlook, start walking through it? Do you want me to address any specific questions that were raised during previous
Let's
testimony?
walk us through it. We will have Representative Kornheiser explain her set aside and her reason. You can just show us where it is. And then, yeah, and the whole testing thing is not going to show up here because I don't think we paid for it. We didn't know about it.
Yes, so, yeah, so I will walk through the Ed Fund Outlook to address your comment, Madam Chair. I do have a, further down in the Outlook, there is a line item just to show what that appropriation from AOE of the reserve PCB dollars is. So that does show up, but it doesn't impact the yields directly because those dollars were reserved last session. And so I guess what I think makes sense then is I'll just start walking through the Ed Fund Outlook.
Yeah, we did not pay for the testing, but we did set 22 million, and then with a proviso, if we got any more, the first 10 million went to the bottom line, and then anything over and above that, because we did have a lot of, we think, one-time money. And we have picked up a lot of expense. I did not realize the settlement with the teachers was going to come out of the Ed Fund. Nobody talked to this committee about it. But it's in here. This was the inflation
Yeah,
Yeah.
so
limit that's in here. So there's a lot of moving parts, but last year we had more than we thought was sustainable sales tax revenue. And I think we aren't seeing the same pool, but we still have some.
yeah, so what I think really makes sense in terms of walking through the Ed Fund outlook is kind of just starting at the top where we've got our summary lines and talking really big picture. And then we can walk through the other sections of the outlook. And remembering that as the yields, as Abby outlined, while the yields are calculated and so is the uniform non-homestead tax rate, they're calculated to factor in other moving policy decisions. So there are policy choices that are included in this Ed Fund outlook, which are then used to calculate the yields and the rates which have been passed out of the House. And so that's why they're included here. Of course, if the Senate has a different position on some of those bills, then they would be reflected in the outlook, and then we could recalculate the yields. I think I've walked through the Ed Fund outlook in the beginning of the session, but just to refresh everyone's memory, these first lines A through I, these are the summary lines. So this is really big picture, what are we looking at? And the yields and the property yield, the income yield, and the uniform non-homestead property tax rate that we're seeing in the yield bill, you see those in lines C, D, and E. And so we see column that's reflecting the actuals in FY22, and then a column reflecting what's projected for FY23, and then the final column, FY24, is showing the construct of the Ed Fund outlook as bills have passed out of the House, including the yield bill. So maybe should I make this a little bit bigger? Would that be helpful?
That might be helpful, yeah.
There's a printout, is that too?
There is a printout on our desk, so you can look at it under your agenda.
We do not have it electronically.
It is also posted on the committee page under my name. My name is Julia Richter, and the title is probably FY24 Outlook or H492 EF Outlook.
This will go on page 486.
No,
Page
it's gonna-
492, education fund outlook.
Yeah,
Okay.
how is that for size? People able to see that? Okay. Okay. So we've got the non-homestead property tax rate and then the two yields. You'll remember that the yields are the statewide numbers that are part of the equation of calculating that local adjustment factor for the homestead property tax, the income property tax. As Abby mentioned, the higher the yield, the lower the tax rate. We're also seeing what the average property tax rate is and the average tax rate on household income up here in lines A and B. And while we're noting that, for instance, the homestead property tax rate is decreasing, projected to decrease from FY23 to FY24, it doesn't necessarily correspond with a decrease in tax bill, a decrease in tax liability, right? Because we've seen so much growth in the grand list this year, we're actually seeing that while the rates are decreasing, the average bill is increasing. So here in line G, we're seeing that across all three categories, this is how I was asked to model and calculate the yields and the rates. Across all three categories, we're seeing an average percentage bill change of an increase of 3.84% compared to the prior year. So despite those decreasing rates, we're seeing an increase in the average bill. And this corresponds with other increases that we're seeing in the Ed Fund. So from FY23 to FY24, statewide education spending grew by 8%, and the statewide education grand list grew by 9.7%. Or sorry, these are estimates for how they will grow in FY24.
Grand list is up because property values going up.
Correct.
Therefore, tax rates are down.
Raise.
Raise.
Tax
Yes.
rates,
Mhm.
but the tax bills are up because of budgets.
Tax bills are up due to a number of factors. How the yields, what the yields are, education spending budgets being higher. We also look at performance of the non-property revenue sources. So you remember that the property taxes are used as sort of that cushion to fill the rest of the education fund. So we've got all of the non-property revenue sources. We have to raise a bit more than, we have to raise a lot more than that. So the rest of that needs to be raised is being raised by property taxes. So we're looking at impacts on the bill. It's gonna be grand list growth, it's gonna be budget growth, and it's gonna be performance of the other revenues that flow into the education fund. And it's going to be all of the other appropriations flowing out of the ed fund, right? So something else that's included in this ed fund outlook that we'll walk through is one of them is universal meals for 29 million. So or other appropriations that are coming out of the education fund. So all of those factors are entering into the swirl of the ed fund, and property taxes is needing to make up that difference. So are there any?
COLA payment was 3 million.
Right, COLA payment, 3 million. So A through I, those are our summary lines. And then moving down into the outlook. We can next look at the sources. So this is what I was referencing before. So lines 3 through 8, sales and use, purchase and use, meals and rooms, lottery transfer. These are non-property revenue sources that are flowing into the education fund.
Whenever I see these summaries and I see equalized pupil count, I'd love it if it was also included actual pupil count, just to also get some perspective on that. That's not easily accessible, is it?
I don't know the number off the top of my head, but it should be just about the same, because the way that pupil weights work in the equalized pupil under current law, there are the actual number of pupils, and then weights are applied, and then the equalization ratio is applied to bring down all of those weighted pupils back down to the actual pupil count.
Right.
So that's, you can think of there being about 400,000 pupils in the state.
It's not, we don't have ghost students in here like we used to have when, I forget which grant we did away with it. Correct. It was calculated on last year's, only last year's was equalized, not, we had an equalization, so you couldn't lose too many students at once. And it became a self-fulfilling prophecy, and we ended up with a large number of ghost students. And because we used last year's count, but that was the count that took into account the loss of students the year before, and it just kept building on each other until some schools that were losing population were getting paid for a significant number of students that didn't actually exist, which is different than the weighting.
Correct. And this is a little teaser for next year. In FY25, the pupil weighting bill is going to kick in, and there's no longer going to be an equalization ratio. So we'll no longer be talking about equalized pupils. We'll be talking about the long-term average daily membership, and we'll be talking about the weighted long-term average daily membership. So that nuance that you're picking up, Senator, about the equalization, that's going to be done away with the passage and into Act 127.
In a way, that's a good reason to have somewhere the total number of real human children counted.
That,
Because when you change the method, then the way that you use to compare what's happened previously is lost. Now, what we see here, though, and what we see year after year after year is a fundamental issue, is the number of kids goes down and the cost of educating them goes up. And I always ask myself, at what point what will the cost per student be when we have no kids in school at all? It's a frightening thought.
the other
Or the
thing
last
I would like to check is that the urban legend grapevine says that we have because of COVID, picked up a lot of students. I know what is my niece's children, nephews 3 times removed or something, that they moved here. They'd been going to school remotely in Boston during COVID and decided to stay. And she said when she took them to school, they said that they'd had quite a few new students. But I also read a census thing that said, yes, we did have a big uptick during, I think it was 21, but that now it looked like we were back to the same level of immigration. So it would be interesting to know what is happening. Did we pick up a lot of students? It doesn't feel like it.
Yeah, so when you look at the trends over time, I did write a report that was tasked for the people from the pupil waiting bill last year. And one of the charges of the report was looking at cost containment strategies. And we did look at the enrollment of students over time, and we are seeing exactly that enrollment is decreasing. And you do see it here in the outlook, just looking at 22 to 23 and then forecasted for 24, we're still seeing that an estimated decline of pupils over time.
1.6% decrease this year.
That's not good. Okay,
What is that relative to pre-COVID? Are we down from pre-COVID?
Yeah, so we've been decreasing over time. I can definitely come back in and present some of those charts that I put
at least
together.
15, I mean, we did 64, it was like 10 years then that it had been declining. Except places like South Burlington, which our former Secretary of State always informed us was an increasing schools. You were the outlier.
A lot of housing growth.
We aren't even gonna talk about housing. I still have wounds.
Well, I think the thing that's obvious from this chart, I think you'll see it in chart after chart after chart, is that the rate of increase in spending is exceeding the rate of decline in student cost. And that kind of the essence of the issue.
Yeah, and I think traditionally what we've been told is you've got 10 kids in a class, you lose 3 kids, but they're not all from the same class. So you still have the same number of teachers and cafeteria workers, but your per pupil goes up, and it takes a long while. And we keep finding different things we want schools to do, all of which I have great concerns about asking the Department of Education to do anything, since we're in transition with secretaries, and they are another department along with labor that was primarily federally funded, and they haven't had the bandwidth to do much of anything. So to put any kind of school construction grants back on them, I'm a little nervous about, unless we do some real work. And I think Brad James is still with us.
Yes.
And because that's, and I guess it's when, not if, we lose Brad, he's eligible to retire. That's a huge set of shoes to fill, that he can tell us about the weighting and about how it's calculated and the numbers, and probably help us track some of these trends.
Yeah, and I will say that data is being collected. We do know how many pupils there are in the state. We do track that. That needs to be tracked so that we can apply the weights and so that we can calculate the locally adjusted tax rates. So what you're looking at really is a gross simplification of all of the really big parts of the statewide education fund, so that it can all exist on a single sheet of paper that we can walk through, and however much time we need to walk through it. But there's a lot of stuff, as I know the committee is aware, that's really happening in the background here, and that differs by district.
Differs by district.
Okay.
So moving out of the summary lines and moving into some of the more details of the Ed Fund outlook, the next section that we're looking at is sources. So we see in lines 3 through 8, those are the non-property revenue sources. So these forecasted numbers are really reflecting what we have gotten from the consensus revenue forecast that is put forth in January. And then we see in lines 1A and 2, the amount that's being raised on the homestead property tax and the amount that's being raised on the non-homestead property tax, or what we estimate will be raised given all of the assumptions that we have baked into this modeling here. We also see
The noticeable discount on line 1B is partly because of the increase in assessed value over the $400,000 threshold. Is that correct?
in part, so 1B, that's the property tax credit. And you remember that that's a 1-year lag. So it's using the income from the prior year. So that's one, that could be one explanation. Another explanation could be that the yields are changing over time. So the income yield is also changing over time. And so too is the tax liability. So this year we're setting the income, the homestead property yields, the non-homestead rate, and the income yields. And then the property tax credit that is going to be calculated using the income yields that the legislature is setting this year is not going to be applied to next year's tax bills, but instead the year after that's tax bills.
And that's what people that pay based on their income don't pay, right? If they were paying, that's the credit, right? If you were not paying your full tax bill because you were paying under the income, percentage of income base, then that's money we aren't collecting.
Right, so we're booking that in this outlook that's kind of being booked as a negative revenue. And what that's capturing is, okay, let's look at how much this homestead, this household would pay on property value using the homestead property tax rate. How much would this household pay on household income using the income rate? And then what is the difference? And if the difference is with the house site caps that you spoke about, the 400,000 and the 225, and if that difference means that someone would be paying less on their income than they would be paying on their homestead, that difference is made up to them in the property tax credit.
And I still haven't, and I don't know if you have, we had some concern, I know Stowe is especially concerned about people who are making the same income they were. A lot of them are older people on fixed incomes, but suddenly the house that was worth $350,000 is now worth $550,000, and what that will do to the property tax rates. And I don't know about anybody else, but I ended up, after listening to the tax department and property valuation, being more confused than I was when I started. And I asked Stowe, and we will have to get back in touch with them to show us an actual tax bill from their town and see, because we've got all kinds of 3-year rolling averages, and I'm assuming some places in South Burlington may be seeing that. They were especially worried about people that had relatively fixed incomes. Stowe is one of our, vacation destination towns that finds their property inflated and is kind of focused on trying to maintain their core year-round residents and historic families that have been there for years. So I will get back in touch with them to see if this concern is actually fleshing out. Because I know we have set up rolling averages so the towns don't get hit by some massive loss or some massive, huge sale that inflates their grand list and,
Yeah, so I think that part of that goes into the way that the equalization study works. So the way that the tax department is looking at sales in a town to calculate the common level of appraisal. That common level of appraisal adjusting the local tax rate. But that,
where it get- that's where it got really confusing.
yeah, it's pretty weedy stuff.
It was very weedy, and it's an art form knowing how to describe weeds to people that just see something green on the ground.
Yeah, so I do think that, and I haven't heard all of your testimony, but I do think that often when I hear this conversation happening, I see sort of, or I hear sort of two parts. One is the CLA and the way that the CLA is adjusting the local tax rates. And the other is the concern of those folks who are having their house site value growing out of what is capped. And so not having the income sensitivity apply to that portion. The flip side challenges, and I know that we spoke about this in the study committee over the fall, but the flip side challenge of that is the more of any tax credit that you want to provide, those revenues need to still be raised or costs need to be cut. And so how is that going to be funded?
And I think the question, and the reason I wanted Stowe to show me some, unnamed, but this is a sample tax bill, is with all of these in, are we talking, because their income hasn't gone up, so they're still sensitized. It's just that portion between, what difference is that going to make? Is it a $25 difference or a $2,500 difference? Because that would make a difference to how much we want to monkey with the levers we have got in there. And then if we monkey with the levers and move that housing value up, then what's the impact? Especially on folks that live in towns where their housing value hasn't gone up, so.
Yeah.
Okay, so I will try and get that again, and see if we could, maybe property valuation can help us out. Give Jill a call, okay.
But definitely, I'd love to dive into it more. I'm also really interested in line 92. I'd love to know what levers there have been over the years on the non-homestead education property tax. I know our constituents, our voters, are most interested in 1A, but and that's absolutely worth our time. But I'd love to, if you have educational materials, you would direct a new member of the Senate Finance Committee on understanding what has been done and what could be done on the levers on line item 2. I would welcome your
Sure, and I would be happy to sit down and talk about any of this.
And there is a bill coming, right,
So
did that not make it?
I'll say one thing and then I'll defer to Abby on the details because she's really the
I know there is something with.
There's a PVR, there's a bill that's looking at, or I'll just let Abby speak to it.
We have it, right?
So there's H480, which has come over from the House, it's definitely in the Government Operations Committee, and it does address property valuation, it does address the CLA and reappraisals in particular.
I know there was said, but I thought in that bill, because that's why we didn't take it up, there was a further granulation of between commercial and second home.
Yes, so to your question about non-homesteads as well, I'll just point out, it's not just second homes, it's also commercial and anything that's not a homestead.
Right.
But yes, that bill has a study requirement that would require the department to look at both redefining non-homestead because of the large swath of types of properties that covers, as well as looking at moving reappraisals to become a state responsibility. So it's a two-part study at this time.
Yeah, and I will add, not anything to Abby's explanation of that bill, but getting back to the question about non-homestead as a lever, back to like sort of taking a big step back and thinking about right now, we're looking at in the yields bill, you're all looking at setting the homestead yields, the income yields, and the non-homestead tax rate. And unless I've been directed otherwise, I solve it so the average bill change across those three classes is proportional. So what you're looking at here is the average bill change across all three classes is an increase by 3.84%, but that's a policy choice. So when asking about what the lever is, it could be that the average bill change across all three classes wouldn't be the same, but I would need direction on how that modeling, what the desire of that model would look like.
When you say bill change, tax bill?
Yes.
Correct, yes, the average tax liability, yes.
Okay, because when we set these tax rates, we set the homestead tax rate lower than the non-homestead tax rate. And we knew at that time, we were told by our joint fiscal staff, for whatever reasons, eventually those lines will cross. And they crossed in Plainfield 10 or more years ago. But it is getting to the point where a larger percentage of towns, the non-homestead rate is now lower than the homestead rate. And I remember when we set that rate saying, yeah, it's really difficult and it will be really painful and we'll kick that can down the road and deal with it when it happens. And the question is, when do we have the intestinal fortitude to look at it? And is this, and probably if we divided it out, because second home markets, I think, are doing a lot better than business properties in most areas of the state. And we have them all lumped, so maybe, yeah, it's been going, yeah. So I think, you know, separating them out. Yeah, so then you may be able to play with those tax rates without being anti-business.
I think that one important, and this is all, this is just something else to keep in mind, is when looking at the comparison of the homestead tax rate and the non-homestead tax rate in the town, that doesn't necessarily mean that the homestead tax liability and the non-homestead tax liability for the same value property is, so because of income sensitivity, we can't necessarily only compare the homestead tax rate and the non-homestead tax rate because there's that income sensitivity for a lot of households.
Right.
Can we, with the current capabilities, increase the non-homestead education property tax rate at a higher percentage rate that only affects what I would characterize as residences and not commercial properties? Or when you apply it by just the way our structure currently is, it would apply to both commercial as well as homes that just aren't declared as homesteads. There's no way to just apply it to houses that aren't commercial properties.
I'll defer to Abby.
Okay, so not without a statutory change, because there are only those two definitions right now, homestead and then everything else that's non-homestead or exempt.
As one member of this committee, I would be interested in the years to come to have that lever available to us, so I could
I
tax.
think
empty
that's,
houses.
I thought that's what was coming to us from Ways and Means, which is why I did, well, ours was to tax them. And we did take some you get into town clerks, and their jurisdiction. And then there were, but that was second homes, and last year we looked at if they were lived in for 6 months but this would just non-homestead, residential, and then commercial, I think.
So that has been the discussion
Yeah.
primarily because of that big swath of types of properties and not homestead, but each 480 that's currently in the other committee directs the department to do a study of all property types. So would there be a different way to categorize both homestead and non-homestead? So it's there was a lot of discussion in the House Ways and Means Committee about specifically this question of how do you determine non-homestead properties? And then it grew as the complexity is.
Well, all
Yeah,
business
you can do that.
properties aren't the same either.
Correct. And there are different types of residences, and there are what are classified as commercial properties that are in fact, condos or apartment buildings that are used. So you get into those trying to
Mixed
figure
use,
out.
you have a
the use.
store on the ground floor and you live upstairs. I mean, it always sounds simple until you get into it.
Bruce?
Yeah.
If I would like, and I know we can't do it this year, but it seems that where I would want to go is if you design a facility for somebody to be able to lay their head down. Okay, if it's a house, it's a residence, I would like to know that from our tax policy, and if it's not a declared homestead, if it's a vacant vacation home, I would like to be able to apply a higher percentage increase should the times call for it on this one. So I'm intrigued to hear more, but I don't think that's an option for us this time.
It sounds like the most we will get now is get a study and get these lined up next year, perhaps, to be able to divide them, which I'm sure will take some computer and other things that would have to be done.
And I think that one other wrinkle to this conversation is just the data that we have available and that we don't have available. So we've been asked to, look at different aspects of grand lists. And at the end of the day, the grand list, while it is broken out by category, those categories, and when thinking in the legal world, I'll defer to Abby, but when thinking about the data world, those categories are not uniform across all towns. And what you may or may not be interested in pursuing may not squarely fit into the grand list data that we have available that already is has a number of caveats just associated with the data that we do have available. So parsing out second homes or vacant homes is a real challenge in the current data that we do have available.
And I think we've all been reacting to the stories of online sales for astronomical prices. A lot of it COVID related. People seem to want to get here. Some, like my niece, are staying. They bought their house before COVID. And they're staying. History says that a fair number of those houses over the next couple of years will probably come back on the market. Unless we have another outbreak of some disease. And they might very well. We had an influx, smaller because it was from New York City, but after 9/11, there was a significant number of people from New York City who just thought they would like a place to go if this thing continued. It didn't, and most of those houses, because they weren't luxury vacation homes, they were just houses, went back on the market. So, and the housing market is due to decline, and they still seem to be thinking we will have a recession, and that will throw a wrench into all of this. And so it's probably best that we are unable to refresh because things may very well change. Okay, yes.
Does PDR have any, they picked up for trends other than
I don't know. I doubt it. I just heard, the thing I saw pop up news, and I think I saved it, was from the Census Bureau on in-migration, and we have returned to post-COVID anemic in-migration.
the,
It is not keeping up with the deaths. We have seen fewer people come in than are dying. Or
okay, some
coming in and
places
being
are,
born,
some places are doing, some communities are doing better than others.
yes.
And it strikes me as being a different group of communities that are doing better than the ones that used to do better, but that seems to be more of an alignment with the national rankings of counties by the level of climate resistance.
Traditionally, it's been, I haven't seen a great influx into our Northeast Kingdom counties because they're climate resistance. We used to see influx in the places where the machine tool and other industries were. Springfield, Rutland, Barry was granite, and there was a building other places in the country. We aren't building granite buildings, and Barry is not what it was and is not growing. Springfield, Rutland are seeing the same things. The new jobs are high tech, and they are centered in Chittenden County, and that's where it's growing.
I mean, this isn't the story about a bunch of blind men, looking at an elephant, all coming up with a different opinion of what an
That's
elephant
right.
was. And I wondered if PVR is able to take each to give us some, what they see that is happening differently than what has been happening for a couple of years.
We can ask them.
I remember the list of counties where the counties in the United States were ranked on their COVID resistance. And seven
that
of
was
them,
climate.
of the top 10 counties in the United States were in Vermont that were on that list.
No one lives there.
Pardon?
No one lives there.
When I talk to people in Bradford,
Yeah.
on tours, how long have you lived here? Why did you come here? Which is kind of a pushy thing that you could do
Yeah,
when you're new and they're
Yeah.
new and you're honestly trying to learn something. But the number of people that came, climate resistance was remarkable.
okay.
And they didn't bring families with them. But they paid good money for houses, sometimes sight unseen.
Okay, yeah,
They showed up.
We
and that was
had-
different.
yes, that was different, and we had a lot of that during 21. The Census Bureau says, now how long they'll stay, and when, and a lot of that'll depend on jobs.
Property valuation review, be able to kind of help us understand what
If
was
they
going on.
can, I'm pretty sure the realtors can tell you where the housing sales happened. They can tell you what counties saw unusual amounts. Property valuation, yeah, we got transfer tax, we can tell where, what counties had, why people came here, we can't. But that was one year. What the Census Bureau says is if all those people stayed, we had a little boom. But we are now back to where the people moving into this state don't offset the people that are dying in this state. No matter what United Van Line says, and I will ponder, I sold senior apartments to many of them. They come here to be near family and then they die.
Why is it houses?
They don't have houses, they are in senior housing.
Yeah.
And so you move them in with another bunch of us that are dying, but our children aren't moving in here to take our place. Or enough, maybe enough to take our place, but not for the state to grow.
No, but it was my children's mid-30s, their classmates were showing back up from Boston and New York and Chicago to live in, not the countryside, but the suburbs of Barry and Burlington.
Barry.
Pardon?
Yeah, but the numbers say that enough of them are not moving in to increase this population of the state, that we're dying faster than we're either giving birth or we're moving in.
I was asking if we could understand that in terms of what the house values were and what the incomes were, as we try to understand what has driven the changes on this sheet.
Not so many rolling averages, I doubt that it's showing up on the sheet. And a lot of it will be showing up as
We can each have our own anecdotal,
Yeah.
but is there any pattern under that the
I would-
realtors, DVR?
I'm sure, if you get on Zillow, they'll tell you. I'm not sure it'll be right, but they'll tell you.
Isn't he a guy that advertises on Fox a lot?
No, this is a whole thing. There's also Realtor.com, but the realtors used to on their website, which may not be public, tell you where housing was selling by county. They can tell you what happened to the average price. And we can have them in. I'll ask if they can put that together and we can have them in to talk to us. But, overall, the boom is over.
Well, the boom that we just had was different than the one we had a couple years earlier, so
When did we have a boom?
well, the patterns are different.
The 1820s.
The 1820s.
1700, it's up.
Just before they opened.
You do know the history of Old Home Days, don't you?
Yeah.
They were done to attract all the young people that went west, where you could put a plow in and not have to stop every 6 inches to remove a boulder. And they were trying, we had a huge out-migration. I can trace out-migration from Montpelier all the way to Oregon. I believe there are 14 of us. And there was an association, but that it was a pure out-migration.
Well, Old Home Days, as I understood it, was someone would come home to visit family. And someone would say, oh, you should have been here 2 weeks ago. Your old best friend from high school was visiting you. So they just have everybody come home at the same time.
Yes, it was to attract you back. We've had out-migration issues forever. We had one in-migration issue when the hippies all came here in the 60s and 70s. But we haven't had a huge immigration since.
I actually wasn't kidding when I said it was the opening of the Erie Canal. So
That also,
it was reasonable to farm in Michigan or Ohio or.
yeah. Okay,
Oh, I
we
remember.
are diverging.
Yeah.
Let's put Julia,
I did that on purpose.
you did that, good, me too.
All
All
right,
right. Senator McDonald is sorry also.
back to the ed fund.
Yes.
So we've walked through the sources, I believe. And so I'm moving on to the appropriations portion. So that's lines 10 through 23. So while we were just looking at, when we were last looking at the ed fund, we were looking at what was coming into the ed fund. Now we're looking at what is going out of the ed fund. Remember that it's really
Which page we
we're still on the ed fund outlook, and we're looking at the appropriations section, which is lines 10 through 23.
spreadsheet.
And so you'll recall that the ed fund, we figure out how much needs to be raised, and then we figure out how much we need to raise in property taxes. So right now we're looking at how much needs to be raised, pretty much. So line 10, that's the education payment. So that is the sum of all of the ed spending that's happening in each school district's budget. And we've got the other lines. Most of them are should look pretty familiar because these are the categorical aid that we've had for the years. So you're seeing those categorical aid lines 11 through 17. And then we've also,
I'm looking at 14, the only one that has a noticeable change is technical education.
yeah, so
Was that COVID? Because we went from 17 to 31 and we're back to 17.
So that's a great pickup. So technical education, line 14, you see that bump up to 31.3 because last year there was a one-time appropriation from the ed fund of 15 million to VHCB for that revolving loan program.
Oh, that's to set up, all right, then that was the tech ed school. So we should get a report on how that's working.
Yeah, I don't know,
Okay,
but that 31.3 is the typical technical ed line plus the 15 million even from the ed fund. And that's why we're seeing that bump up in FY23. You'll also notice line 11 is the other one. Sorry, go ahead.
no. Who's monitoring that revolving loan? Tax? Ed?
I would reach out to VHCB.
DHC? Okay.
I believe that the appropriation was to them to establish the program.
I remember, yeah, it was 15.
15 million.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay,
Um,
that, but I was trying to trade off the money for PCP testing or remediation.
All right. And then the other line where you do see some more change is line 11, the special education aid, where you see in 22, it's 229 million, and it goes down to 208 million, and then forecasted for FY24 of 226. And that's really because AOE has carried forward funds, so they did not need some of those carry forward funds were used. And these, with the exception of education payment, the education payment is really just reflecting what we saw in school district voted budgets. So that's been updated since town meeting day. But the other categorical aid lines reflect the GovRec amounts for categorical aid. So we also see universal school meals in here. It passed, there's the policy bill that passed out of the House, H165, and the funding for universal meals, the appropriation was included in the budget. So that's why you have that H494. So we're estimating.
When we put the money in last year, it was gonna stay.
So we're estimating in FY24 that will be 29 million. And I'm happy to come in another time and walk through the fiscal note once.
Yeah, on the school meals.
That'll be
Because
helpful.
there's several, they're still trying, the anticipated increased federal participation with new easy fill out forms didn't materialize any new qualified students or
Yeah,
anywhere
so
near what they thought. Now there's something new going on with Medicaid, so we'll have you or whoever come in and talk.
Okay, yeah, I would be happy to talk about that. So this 29 for FY24 reflects the Medicaid enrollment into free and reduced lunch and also assumes an increase in participation from this year. Because AOE's implementation report talked about some factors that were potentially suppressing participation. Then we have the latest forecasted estimates for teachers' pensions and OPEB. That's in lines 19 and 20. And then line 21, that's also included in the budget. That is that one-time COLA, cost of living adjustment payment of 3 million.
Did that go through a budget adjustment
No, I believe that that is included in the House passed budget.
in the House passed budget?
Yeah,
Okay.
H494.
Because we haven't talked about that as a committee. Appropriations, I know, talked about it. And that was back in the, I don't know, 2017, 16, when we were looking at deflation or the potential for it. There was an agreement reached that COLA would never go above 3% or.
I would
And
have to defer to
yeah.
Chris Roop in our office. He's the pension.
Anyway, it went higher this year. And there was a cap in law and the teachers were upset. So we'll find the bill and find out where it is, but this is what it costs to make a one-time payment to make teachers whole this year. And then I think the proposal is to do away with the cap. But I've learned about it in money chairs. What I didn't learn was it was going to come out of the ed fund.
Well, we're currently carrying it in the ed fund.
Okay.
That's how it came out
It
of.
is a one-time expense though.
So, yes, so currently it's a one-time COLA payment.
And then it goes back to OPEB.
And then the other uses line is pretty typical, and so then we've got our total uses line in 23. The next set of lines, that's really just reflecting what we were just looking at. It's looking at, okay, what is the difference between what we're raising in revenue and what is going out of the ed fund after factoring in use of surplus dollars. We see that there was the 45.5 million in reversions in FY23, which I believe the commissioner came in earlier this year and spoke to you about, or maybe not.
No,
Okay, so there was 45.5 million in reversions back to the ed fund in FY23, which is higher than normal.
reversions back, that's money we did not.
That's money that was appropriated to AOE.
Yes.
They didn't spend it because, for whatever reason, they couldn't, they didn't need to. And so that money has now come back to the ed fund and is falling into the bottom line for you all to reappropriate those dollars.
Okay, so I
Or
was looking
put
at
them
those
in
as
tax rates.
a minus in parentheses.
Yeah, it's a little misleading carrying it as a negative, but that's money coming into the ed fund.
No, I took accounting class and when they tell me money going in is, that's the way it is.
Yeah. And so then, so moving down, we've got the stabilization reserve, that's 5% of the prior year's net appropriations. And so we're forecasting in FY24 that it'll be 46.7. So we need to put in 4.9, about 5 million to just fill up the stabilization reserve further. And then we get into these final policy aspects, which we have already been talking about. But first is the PCB reserve that Michael walked through. Last year in the yield build at 32 million was reserved in the education fund. 2.5 of those 32 was dispersed by the emergency board this past fall for immediate uses. And then the bill that Michael walked through is really saying, okay, we're going to take back those dollars that haven't been promised or spent, and we're going to appropriate the 29.5 that still is sitting in reserve to AOE for this grant, for these grants for remediation and removal of schools that have already been tested for PCBs. And because those dollars were already reserved within the ed fund, they don't have an impact on the yields. It was money sitting aside for PCB, so and then we have the cannabis funds. There was in session law, and it's also, I think, is included in the budget. that the cannabis sales tax revenue is to be dedicated for after-school programming. So this is just pulling those dollars away, saying, okay, they've been spoken for to go to a special fund. And so we can't spend them, but they're baked into the consensus forecast. So we just need to have them here until they can be appropriated.
Okay.
And then lastly, we have the tax rate offset reserve, which Abby walked through. That's what was established in the yield bill. So that's the 22 million that will be put towards lowering tax rates in the December 1st letter, and then will be up to the discretion of the General Assembly how those dollars will or will not be used. And then our
Is that 22 million at all related to the possible suspension of the PCB testing? Are they all connected?
No,
So the way that the 22 million was reached in the, and I know that you will get Chair Kornheiser in, but the construct that was passed out of the House was they asked for me to model the yields and the non-homestead rate to be as mathematically similar to the December 1st yields and rate as possible while maintaining the same average bill change. So if you
that
recall,
was for this year.
for this year,
And I know they were very proud, so Representative Kornheiser was very proud that they came in right on as close as you can to the December 1st letter projection.
so the December 1st letter, we take all the information that we have available to us at that time. And with the administration, we solved the yield model to put all of the dollars that are unreserved, unallocated into lowering tax rates uniformly.
Yeah.
But then over the course of the session, there's a ton of data updates that are happening. And that's why you're seeing here, we have 1 million deficit on the bottom line, just because since the yield bill passed out of the House, I've done more data updates. So we've just moved a little bit the ed fund to best reflect what's going on.
I am under the impression, this is a broader question that touches directly upon this, that we used to have town meeting days in May and then we moved them to March for different reasons. Do you think it would make more sense to have school budgets voted on later in May rather than in March, in making some of these questions better timed?
So I think that if school budgets were to be voted in May, then the way that this is currently happening something would need to change, because we have our budget estimates. We have our budget estimates, and then we update them further once the budgets, I think all but 2 budgets that have been put to voters so far have passed. So we can come in quite close and say, okay, this is how many dollars we need to raise. We've got a pretty good idea of what the grant list is going to look like, so we can model pretty closely what needs to come in. So if the budget votes were to be pushed out further, then we would need to wait another year to vote, or the General Assembly would need to wait another year to calculate those yields, or the General Assembly would need to calculate the yields and the rates with their best estimate at the time, but it might not be as close to funding the budgets as it currently is. So it's sort of that question of how precise do the yields and the rates need to be versus how much time do you want to give voters, school districts.
Okay.
So that's that 22 million. And then we really are getting to the bottom of the sheet where we've got the prior year unreserved, unallocated, and the current year unreserved, unallocated. So with the updates that we've done since it passed out of the House, there's now 1 million that is in the red.
So we only put 21 in.
So you could put, if you were to put 21 million in the tax rate offset reserve, you could keep the House's same construct, just to clean up that 1 million.
And I know Representative Kornheiser talked about a reserve, and we had talked about a reserve when we were doing the income based property tax, education tax. And The economists are still saying that it is quite possible, if not likely, that we will have a recession. During recessions, income and sales go down. Plus, next year, we are doing the weighting, and that will be phasing in. That will have, there's hold harmless, and until we get there, we're not sure what impact that's going to have. And most of all, we don't want to see property taxes shoot up, especially during recession. So just trying to put something aside. To have it all have to go next year, though, is interesting. And because the stabilization reserve is will really be there to cover unexpected costs.
Yeah, so my understanding of the tax rate offset reserve is, and I'll let Abby chime in on this if she has anything else to add, but my understanding of the tax rate offset reserve is that it needs to be applied to the December 1st letter. So when the commissioners is calculating those tax rates, consensus with us, JFO, but it doesn't necessarily need to be used for lowering tax rates. But I'll defer to Abby.
But if we don't use it, and the projection figures $22 million in revenue, this sounds like the House we got one-time revenue and the House wants to spend it all at once, and we kind of like to step it up so that we don't artificially deflate this year and then have to raise it twice as much next year, which gets people very upset. Look, I don't know if you're getting the reaction to the proposed 20% increase in motor vehicle fees. The fact that we haven't raised them for 10 years, but that big jump really gets people. So, all right. And that's different than I thought she was talking about. So we'll have.
So I'll
Blake,
let Abby chime in.
Do you want me to speak to that?
Yeah.
So it sets aside the 22 million in fiscal year 24 to offset property tax rate increases in fiscal 25. It doesn't actually spend it or bind the legislature in fiscal 25. So there would still need to be some action taken to spend it or to apply it. That said, there would also need to be some sort of notwithstanding of the language passed saying, no, we're going to use it for some purpose other than offsetting.
Right, but if we figure we have an additional $22 million sitting on the bottom line, we are going to say to the schools, this is what we project your tax rate for. We'd have to be pretty brave or foolhardy to then say, nope, we've decided to spend that $22 million on something else, and your tax rates are going to go up. That would not be popular. The reserve is, to have a reserve at a time when the economy is not overly stable is not a bad thing. But you usually don't, unless you know that there's some big hit that's going to up your property taxes next year. Like we do raise the tax rates on second homes. Care about that, but something, and it could be the weighting study, but I don't think we know yet if the weighting study, once we implement it, if it's going to up. Well, it'll up some tax rates and it won't others, and we've got some ramping up and ramping down. But we won't, and it's good to have a reserve for that, but we'll have to, we'll talk with Representative Kornheiser and see why she was doing this. And why it's required that it all gets spent next year. Is it a 3-year or 5-year? grandpa to weights.
So the weights are 5 years, but the way that the transition for the weights was passed is that the new weights will immediately take effect in FY '25. So this is our last year of the current law weights, and then in FY '25, the new weights will kick in. And then there's a transition provision to limit tax rate increases to no more than 5% compared to the prior year. When calculated under the same funding formula, with sort of the safeguard that if a district has ed spending that's greater than 10%, they need to go to a tax rate review board, where the tax rate review board will deem if their spending was or was not excessive. And if it was excessive, then they can't receive that 5% cap. And if it was not excessive, then they can still receive the 5% cap.
When we did this, we were not in the midst of the inflation, especially the inflation in wages. So if we limit your school to 5% overall, where I think this envisions it's a 5% increase due to the fact that you're getting less state aid because of the formula. But if you limit it to 5%, plus in order to keep teachers, you've got to give them a 5% raise. That could cause some problem. That made me some thinking through. Because I think that was just meant no more than, but, and I don't know. We know you can do better graph. We, know now,
No,
we don't know.
so we still don't know what school districts will decide to do.
That's it, because some of them have been just getting extra money and not have the kids to spend it on. And some of them will get extra money. The intention is that they should use that money to provide extra services to the students they have. But nothing prevents any school from putting it all into decreasing their tax rates.
Yeah, and I think that you bring up a really important and interesting piece here, that the change of the weights, school districts are not necessarily having changes in funding. With the change in weights, school districts are seeing changes in tax capacity. So their ability to draw from the ed fund. But the change in weights isn't saying, okay, District A, you're now getting X number of dollars more, and District B, you're getting X number of dollars less. It's saying, okay, District A's taxing capacity is changing, and District A will decide how to adjust its budget to with that new tax capacity. So will the other districts in the state. I think that's a really, really important nuance to think about when thinking about the change in weights.
So you're taxing, you used to get, for a certain student, you would count for 1.5 students, which meant that you got to draw down.
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily.
So the ed fund, the use of pupil weights in Vermont is different than it is in other states, because it doesn't necessarily correspond with a direct funding amount. So if you think about the calculation of that local adjustment factor of our property tax rate, right? You've got education spending per equalized pupils or per weighted pupils divided by the yield. So we're only talking about that change in equalized pupils or that change in weighted pupils. So school districts, the weights don't say to school districts, okay, you're getting, 20 extra weights for children from economically disadvantaged backgrounds, so you need to spend X number of additional dollars to those students. It doesn't even say you need to draw X number of dollars more from the education fund. It just says, okay, you have students with
X characteristic.
with a certain characteristic that will make it potentially more costly for the school district to provide services or educate those students. So for that reason, we're gonna make it less burdensome or easier for you to draw dollars from the education fund than a district that doesn't have as many of those costly, quote unquote, characteristics. And that's really the distinction of weights versus categorical aid. Weights are taxing capacity. Categorical aid is here are funds that you have to spend for this specific purpose.
Right. All right, I had this visualized when we were doing it, but I have lost the vision.
Yeah, I live in this world, so
Yeah, I think it was Brad James who finally made it come clear. But your state grant is based on your number of equalized pupils, right?
no, the funds that your district receives is your budget.
Is your budget. All right, so the state, I am qualified to draw down. I get, all right, I, because I've got 50% of my kids have a certain characteristic which costs more to educate. I have the ability to budget up to a certain amount without getting into the above the state average, because my average is on the weight. I'm trying
So,
to
okay.
remember how this works.
So let's say that you have a school district. Sorry.
So I would take two school districts that I would be familiar with. Winooski is likely to see a decrease in the property tax rate, but there's nothing that's prescribing how they would spend that. They could just transfer it on to a lower tax rate to their school, but, or they could, you know what, rather than lower the taxes, we could actually spend some more money on this, and this that they need. Whereas another school district in my district is seeing the opposite, which they're seeing the property taxes go up. And so now they're gonna be faced with, well, we can ask the voters what they support it, or we can cut this, and this. And so those are the decisions. Is that what you were circling?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that I get,
Okay.
it's
It's to the local
taxing,
districts.
yeah, it's local districts, and it was the taxing capacity concept that was throwing me. You are now, you're,
It's really how much can you draw from the education fund for a certain tax rate?
okay,
So if you have a school district, the more weighted pupils that school district has, the more funds that they can draw from the education fund for the same tax rate as a school district that has fewer equalized pupils
fewer schools,
and lower
because it's
spending levels.
It's based on the cost per pupil, and if 50% of your kids are weighted, then you in effect you can draw down 4 more pupils and still come out with the same tax rate for the school district next door that has fewer physical bodies, but nobody has the characteristic or characteristics. So they would have the same tax rate, but this town could be providing services for a lot more students and actually spending more money per student, per live student.
Exactly.
Okay.
And so to Senator Chittenden's point, it could be exactly what you just walked through, or it could be instead of deciding to spend a lot more, the district could decide to have a much lower tax rate.
Right.
And there's
just
nothing
keep
stopping
doing
that
it.
district from doing that, and that's why it's important to remember that weights are really about taxing capacity and not about funding, because the district has that decision.
And that was the whole discussion around grants.
Exactly.
Because grants go out specifically to provide a service. And that was, yes, you remember English, ELL and ES, yeah, English second language students. the first proposal was to make those a grant because they wanted, those kids needed special services and they wanted to make sure it went. And then it hit the fan and got really nasty because, yeah, it was painful for the people trying to make that decision. And so it has gone back to being a weight and a heavy weight. And the question is, will the towns that are getting that heavy weight hire a lot more English as second language teachers? Can they even find them? Will they hire tutors? Well, you don't know, or they could just say, these are people that have been putting the bill for years and we're just gonna lower the taxes. Or put it into football, or, I mean, it's their budget, and
Exactly.
this one, we're trusting them to be adults, which is rare for us. Okay. All right. So we get 22 million net. This spreadsheet, is it reflect taking out the set aside for the PCD remediation?
Yeah, so this outlook reflects the appropriating of the 29.5 that's in reserve. So you see that here in line 34B. Line 34, you see that we have the 29.5 still in reserve. And in line 34B, you see that as constructed in H486, the appropriation of those 29.5 reserve to AOE for those grants.
As Representative Stevens said when he was presenting the paid family leave to economic development, June in Montpelier was beautiful. Because I think this one is gonna be hard fought, at least by me. I'm very concerned about. I don't know how many engineering groups there are in the state that have the capacity to do the PCB testing, but it is a very bad business precedent to just because we changed our mind. And the money's there, but we're gonna spend it somewhere else. I mean, that, if a private business did that, they'd be in court for fault of contracting. To me, it's questionable ethics, and I'm a little disturbed about it. And knowing, I mean, we have an obligation to know our kids are breathing better. And I don't think their parents are gonna be. And we've got a facility study coming in, and now we're doing another study. But it's not an emergency to put new windows in the school, but it is an emergency to get out poison. So we will see.
I agree with you, Sharon.
Yeah. Okay. Other questions? Thank you. Lots of here. Lot of moving pieces. Committee. Tomorrow. Okay. We're gonna look at H70. That got mentioned to us, I believe, by our drafter. We were talking about things we might do, it sounded like there were some good actors and bad actors when it came to citing in 248A. And that I've been told since then, we will look at age 70, but that it is fairly severe and, you know, both of these sponsors had a citing proposal in their town that was causing a lot of consternation. I don't know what's happened to those sightings. We talked about extending the time so towns had better time to prepare, or neighbors did. And I have been told that there is there was a scarf law. There's a federal law that puts severe restrictions on the time that telecom companies have to get either permitted or get things
Or
built.
entitled to an answer.
Yeah,
That's the.
is that what, so
that's-
there,
it's
we're
almost
gonna.
it gets squeezed.
Yeah, so, but that's the feds, and so we are going to hear from them. And then I've been asked to put Mac Mountain on next week because they are doing a lot of this siting kind of work. But if we can't find any way to tweak it to make it better, I haven't heard anyone say they want to dump it, so I'd like to, you want to dump it?
No, just for my, I went and got House Bill 110, or I might be conflating them, because there were two bills.
All right, this is 70 and it's,
Right, so 110 was the other.
okay.
70 says a shortage, I just pushed the date. 110 was some reforms, it comes from Representative Dolan, who lives down.
No, maybe it's,
You
no,
gotta
maybe it's
switch.
Dolan.
Okay,
110 is the date and 70 is the report.
Is, yeah, this 70 is,
so but I just read it once, and I was trying to get ready for a better discussion on this, because she lived through this whole tumultuous sighting down in the valley, she had thoughts about what we might, what the legislature might say.
maybe we will ask Representative Dolan and Pat to come in and just talk.
Here, right?
But there is upset and there is outcome. And I think we heard they proposed to put it 10 feet from our school. Well, then you heard, but it sounds like at least AT&T is fairly amenable to moving a tower if you don't want it there. It seems like we might, the big concern seemed to be, my neighbor just leased the land. He lives on the other side of that hill, but the tower is right there outside my window. And that may be something we can set back. We could talk about setting back from schools. I have been advised that we are prohibited from doing anything for health reasons. So if we do something, it would be aesthetics. And I think that to me, it is aesthetics. So you shouldn't have to look out your kitchen window at.
Could use twitching.
Okay. But anyway, we're gonna work our way through that. I have a feeling there isn't a whole lot we could do. And we are going back then to some of the miscellaneous tax. The one that is throwing me right now is dispatch, and I have a meeting, I think, with all the relevant money or chairs on dispatch in the pro tem's office tomorrow. The people I've talked to seem to share my concern that we need some more background information, and we really do need to get a good portion of the towns to buy in, but if the towns are actively opposed, it's going to be very difficult to get it through this body, never mind have it work. So I'm trying to tie down what information we need before we can go set a formula.
I don't know if you're game for it or not, but I was thinking about it last night, how, when we first had, I think, Senators Watson and Hardy came in together,
Yeah.
did a longish presentation. But I think it was hard to appreciate because we hadn't yet thrashed about the bill for 10 days. Now we've
Yes.
done a lot of thrashing. I was thinking, maybe it would be helpful to have them in for 10 or 15 minutes to say, so as a reminder of what they did, why, so, because it might make a lot more sense to hear it this. I was
As we
feeling
go
like it might
through
make a lot more sense to me at least to hear it the second time, now that we've looked at all these bits
Yeah.
and pieces.
And I did talk with Senator Hardy last night. She understands that the funding is ours and the funding gets tied to a lot of things like the local structure and, yeah. She is very tied to her big board. I did talk with, you know, the 911 chair today, and I'm trying to set up, have Commissioner Wilson come in and Friday and talk to us about this. I'm getting the impression they think there's information that needs to be out there before, you know, like Ruth says, well, the state's still gonna be doing dispatch. I thought we were doing this because the state wasn't gonna be doing dispatch.
And DSP was running a business.
Yeah, and it's just a,
Dispatch for their own, for state police.
yeah, no,
But
this is for other towns. Well, okay, so maybe we just need to make those towns pay. Where's the map she gave me?
And they were trying to shrink.
That's what I thought they were trying to get rid of dispatch for all these
Yeah.
other entities.
I,
That's what we've been talking about for
that's
6
what
or
I
7
thought.
years.
Well, the Sheriff Gov said, oh no, but the state does, the state, and there is the PSAPs and there are the state police.
Mhm.
And the state police,
I think,
she gave me a bunch of maps, which are, maybe she took them back.
Didn't we build a new police
maybe Mr.
state
Whitaker.
barracks in Westminster and co-locate a
Mhm.
PSAP?
We did.
PSAP too.
Yeah,
There's a difference between a PSAP and a dispatching facility.
right.
Right.
And the state police dispatch police for most of the state.
Mhm.
And considering that the state police provide police service for most of the state, that probably makes some
Maybe
sense.
geographically, but not necessarily by the number of calls.
Right,
Because the more populated areas typically have their own dispatching capability that is local
Yeah.
or regional in nature.
so that, it's the fire and the EMTs which get the bulk of the calls, I think, probably emergency management or emergency services more than anyone.
The other thing I wonder, I don't really understand the E911 board grows by heat, which it seems like a large number to me. And even if we were to agree to that construct, it still begs the question, are we like, well, we're not moving to the system, we're just building a transition to it. So you need 8 people, even if you were agreeing, you need 8 people right away. So that part confused me a little bit.
And I was reading the transition steps last night. And to me, and what I said to Ruth is, maybe we just need to do the transition first, because it talks about doing an inventory of the equipment, doing a, an assessment of personnel and costs, and getting a list of what we have. And then finding out where we don't have and figuring out what that was gonna cost. And I think there needs to be some, if we have decided this is a state function, if it isn't, then we should just get the hell out of it and let the towns deal with it. But if this is a state function and I think it is, then we need to have some commitment for some financial support. And Allison says, but we're giving the towns $20 million. And I said,
Peanuts.
yeah, at least we should have a commitment to help buy new equipment that this state board says you have to have. Those are the big expenses that are scaring the towns. And we're gonna come in and say, you gotta buy all new ambulances that meet this thing and all new radios and all new. And, just send the money to the state and we'll send it back to you. So I'm gonna work to see if we can get, even Barbara Neal said to me today, she needs the ability to hire some, what did she call them, subject experts. What do you need? How many personnel? What is interconnected? Who can talk to whom? None of us know that.
Yeah, so
This is
on
a
that,
discussion.
on that same point, so the inventory would be great. But then at least tentatively setting a standard, because otherwise you don't know how far away you are from where you're gonna go. And if the inventory, well, you see where you were, but if you're thinking about a transition and you don't know what the new standards will be, then it's pretty blind. It's like, okay, I know where we are, but you haven't yet known where we're going.
Right. And I think that's what the towns are afraid of, that they've spent money and now somebody in Montpelier is gonna say, sorry, you've got to spend more money and buy our equipment. And I'm afraid that if we fail, that we won't have, we won't pick it up again for 5 or 6 years till we're, healed our wounds or enough new people are in here to try again. And we need to get this done.
The all new equipment thing, they might well be, I don't know, but I would hope that people are buying equipment that's not so unique that even though it's their choice, it would still operate in the right way to talk to other things.
Why would they?
Well, are there no standards? Is everyone making?
My brother-in-law has a deal, I bought some of this at an auction, you pay me for it, all that. You can.
I don't know.
There are no standards.
Well, it's the issue of statewide standards, and why that's so important. And also interoperability, failover, and those types of things.
We need, another ice storm could show up any day and take down a good portion of the state and leave it unable to communicate.
We had this board that, composed of a lot of the people who were supposed to solve this problem, and I think admittedly, they agree they didn't solve the problem.
No. And we're not gonna be able to pass a bill that solves the problem. We need to get buy-in from the people we're trying to help. And that's a much longer, slower process. We probably need to pay some facilitators. But the bulk of the towns have dispatch. We've got to find an alternative for the towns that are using the state police or PSAPs, or if you're using PSAPs for free, you pay. So we got to, and that will be painful and they won't like it. But a good portion of the state has a system that's working. We haven't had any tragedies because we couldn't get people dispatched. I think we need to have some security like a contract, so if a new sheriff gets elected, he can't just say, sorry.
Mhm.
It has to be.
My uncle sells radio equipment. We're gonna switch the county over.
Yeah, yeah, and I can get you such a deal. And who cares if you can, we haven't dispatched a fire truck to Washington County in 20 years, so who cares? Until you do, so, okay. So I'm going in
Look.
and fill out tomorrow.
On where?
The pro tem is gonna talk to us. Ruth wants her bill out. We can fund it however we want, but she wants that big board. And she said to me, but those towns aren't gonna pay for anything that they're not paying for now. They're just gonna send the money to the state and get it sent back to them. And I said, we don't even do that in Act 60. I mean, you keep your money for your school and you send the surplus, or you get a check. And so I'm not sure where the $20 million is. And she tells me, well, Jane's involved and on board with this, and Jane says, I haven't even seen the bill, so we're
This
trying to work it out.
got through crossover though, did it not?
It did not.
It did not, okay, that's what I wanted to make sure of, because I don't know, well, of course, as a committee, we certainly haven't dealt with it in final.
Well, we weren't gonna, I mean, we got it Thursday night and had to have it out Friday afternoon. I would like to get it out this year so that the House has next year to work on it. I don't want to send out a bill that I don't feel proud to stand up on the floor and support. I mean, I want a bill that's gonna succeed because.
And what is it that the league is simply saying, is that we don't agree with it, or we would like to see something else with any specifics?
What I heard from them is, right now they run their own little fiefdoms. And they control the cost and they control their fiefdoms. And they need some money to buy equipment occasionally. And they don't mind, yeah, this is a good thing. What's making them nervous is some group up there is going to assess them a fee based on a formula. And they don't know, nor do they have any control over what's the base amount that fee is. And we can't tell them, you know, we're picking up 15 new towns and the bill's only gonna be $1 million more total for the state. I mean, we can't even give them that kind of a ballpark. And I think they're the ones, and what happens if you voters don't vote for the budget? They need to feel like they're part of it. That's what I was hearing.
So if I go back to like square one, I realize I can't answer the fundamental question of what problem are we solving with this house? But I mean, I don't know.
Well, the state police want to stop dispatching, at least for things other than
But this feels way
police.
bigger than that.
It is way bigger than that.
It's kind of a haphazard system that some places in the state get emergency, get a call and get emergency service, and other states are, other places are ill-suited for geography or.
Right. I mean, I'm thinking we could all answer this question, we could guess an answer in a different, I don't think we'd all think the same thing. I'm kind of curious what GovOps explicitly said, here's how we're defining the problem that we're going to solve.
What they saw it as they were charged with setting up a statewide dispatch system.
Okay.
And they have set up a system. It's just,
They didn't say it's just, right.
well, they have a system on paper, yes, and it's a very definite system. But the people that system is, that are actually doing the work and that the system is being imposed upon are not feeling confident.
So on S5, for what we said, we're setting up a system. It's going back from the plan. Then there's a full stop, and then there's the legislature evaluates a plan for implementation. And recommending that as like a model, but in a way, it seems like a bottleneck. what if we said, instead of buying the entire program laid out in the bill, we said, well, what's a major deliverable, a plan that we could then evaluate somewhere down the line?
Yeah.
And then say, before we implement it, we need to understand what we're getting everyone into. And right now, it doesn't seem like we know enough to say what everyone would get into.
And that's what the towns were saying, we need a runway. And, you know, you get to the runway and there's a marker, and if your plane's not going fast enough, you abort, you know, you don't, once you leave that runway, you've got to go up in the air, you're in trouble. And we don't have that basic inventory. We don't know what each town is spending. We don't know proportionately how many lives are out there that don't have service. And I
We also
I
don't
think
seem to
that's-
know what we're aiming for either. I mean, like, if there's a standard that does all the
asked
things we keep
Mr.
talking about,
Wood.
the interconnectedness, the fail
Yeah.
back, the this, the that. I don't
I think
if
we
have
want
a clear
as-
picture of that either.
Close to as humanly possible, have a system that when you pick up a phone and getting phone service, as I think some of us found out on one of those Saturdays when cable and everything else went down. But when you pick up the phone and you dial 911, there is a seamless system to get emergency services you need to you as quickly as possible. And also rectifying the fact, it was Jesse Baker who said, right now, some people are paying nothing and getting good service because they're using the state police as their dispatchers. Some people are paying twice because they're paying for the state police, plus they're paying for their own municipal dispatch. And there's a few that don't seem to be getting anything. But most of it seems, I mean, we've got dispatch from Keene, New Hampshire, and Colebrook, New Hampshire. We don't have any dispatch from Canada. We have one from Massachusetts. But they're big enough systems, so they are sustainable.
So I would just say, I think what they were trying to solve is three things. They want to get sustainably, reliably funded sources of money to pay for regional dispatch that will reduce our response times. And I think they were looking at trying to address the inconsistencies with all the different systems out there. But what I didn't see in what came over from GovOps as this shifts over to possibly some sort of study or plan, I certainly want to go back to the report that came to us from Paul White, the regional dispatch working group from December 1st, about possible other funding mechanisms. I see the universal service fee based on that service before is relative to the rest of the country as a lot lower in Vermont than elsewhere. And I think one of the biggest concerns that the towns have is this would be a taxing formula, sending them a bill that they have to pay for while they have less control. Whereas if we change the conversation around a taxing formula where they have to pay a certain amount, but instead we look at nothing this year, but a possible increase in the universal service fee to raise monies to then be used over 10 years to align all these regional dispatches to have the consistent technology so that we can reduce our response times while having everybody talk to each other. I think that's a direction to go in. So I definitely want the universal service fee to be part of the conversation.
I started reading this last night till I got called to go off. But the original charge from the legislature was, let's see. But it in several places talked about, clearly, page 1, clearly identifies the potential impact on property taxes and does not unduly affect property taxes. The bill that we have doesn't talk about it.
And it would affect municipal property taxes through the formula.
It is possible, but we don't know that because we don't, everybody's going to pay a share of the whole, but we don't know what the whole is. And so no town can sit there and look, this is what I'm paying now, this is what I'm gonna pay under the formula. I like the formula or I hate it.
And there's some towns that aren't paying anything.
Right, they're gonna hate it, and there's nothing I can do about that.
Slightly weird thing about doing it via property taxes. A universal service, it's really like it would make sense as a capitated fee. That's like, it's every individual, regardless of property, it's gonna,
That's why,
it has the same service delivery.
that's why I like the universal service fees, because that's on wireless phones, and that's what's being used to call 911. So if I pay for a phone, I have a phone, I want that service to be reliable. So I feel like tacking a fee onto it is
We should
rational.
do that, except I will warn you, everybody else, we've been chronically underfunding.
Sure.
And you're looking for a piece of that action. And eventually, unless the Fed is, once the Feds cut off money, that is our money for broadband, which is not particularly a good idea. Yeah, I think that can definitely be part of the funding formula. And we're gonna, unless we're gonna buy out all the equipment and all the, which I don't think we wanna do, we're gonna have to allow the towns to have some control over their destiny. And
One other thing, in an earlier life, I was a project manager on tech projects. And it's like, if I think about what's this in here, there's like no way I could or would bid on this. This feels like you'd be bidding on a swamp. And unless it had like unlimited funds and no expectations of success, it would be a bad contract to get done right now.
Yeah.
You get slaughtered on it.
That's why I like what GovOps has done. I like the expanded board and authority of E911. If we empower them to set the standards that gradually over time and fund them, that they can then subsidize all the little regional dispatches to conform to their standards on a timeline that makes sense. I think that will get all the fishes swimming in the same direction.
then we've gotta get the commitment to subsidize.
Which is why it's
And
universal.
and help subsidize the town.
What's on our website?
I don't know.
Yes.
You can check.
Yeah. But it's going to be nice June and
What?
Montpelier in June is lovely.
There's another, sorry, since this discussion, there's another report JFO shared with me about universal service fees. It's by the U.S. Tax Association. Maybe I'll send it to you, Jill, but it's from the Tax Foundation from 2022, and it shows how much Vermont charges in total of wireless fees relative to the rest of the country. And quite surprisingly, we're at very low relative to the rest of the country. So I think that's what I keep citing. I think why we should just drop universal service fees for this discussion.
And there was a legal limit to what we could raise them. And we raised, I think it's it's 2.4 now, and we raised it to what the limit we could to get money for broadband. So, yeah, and we know the E911 board has been running $1 million at least in deficit. If we're going to expand that, we're going to have to come up with more money for it.
We discussed last week, asking for a list of ways in which we assess wireless companies, wire companies, and communication companies for rights of way. I think, Winter had a bunch of expressions of what they were.
There are whole, let's see. I believe it's tax. There's legislation that went in that said that the Agency of Transportation can charge a fee or shall charge a fee for poles situated in their right of way, so any kind of poles along the highways.
Or buried fiber
I
in the
don't know about
interstate.
buried
corridor or something.
fiber, and this was
Whatever they are.
poles. And, but it was also very specific that that money shall be deposited in the ed fund, and I said something to Jane and she just rolled her eyes at me. But for whatever reason, AOT has not done that. I told Mr. Whitaker, the law is very clear, it goes to the transportation fund, not to dispatch. And he told me about, I had the opportunity to be the leader in doing this entire integrated standard,
It's not being collected, it's not going to the transportation.
it's not, and why, I mean, I am not the transportation committee, why AOT is not setting a fee for money that would benefit them, I don't know, and we can look at it. I would prefer that AOT, the transportation committee, look at it, which is why I mentioned it to Senator Kitchell. But they're having enough trouble with the motor vehicle fee. I will ask again. There's got to be a reason that they are not doing it.
We keep going back to inventory, what's out there in the way of durable things or taxable things or services that.
Or dedicate, or space.
And without those sorts of inventories, it's kind of hard to put together a model.
Okay. So I shall, on your behalf, hold out for more information before we start setting tax rates.
I have a phone message from you from Braintree, which when you read it, you will go, I'd much rather be working on inventory.
You have a phone message for me from Braintree.
Well, it was sent to me from Braintree.
Well, because you represent Orange County. I represent Braintree. Okay.
Doesn't dispatching seem like a lot more productive?
No, I've had several of these calls lately who are just, people for whom the court and no other system is getting them what they want.
Yeah.
So,
Lost.
it is part of the job and I do what I
Lost in
can.
Braintree. I don't know.
Yeah, I think
Option.
I'd rather do dispatch. That's gonna be a complicated one.
That whole issue of dispatch, there's, again, that fundamental question that I believe that GovOps was charged with determining first, is this a statewide function or is it not? If it's a statewide function, should it be informed by a statewide organization? Or should it be centralized and
Yeah.
you see which path they went. I mean, the option, I think at the beginning of this, talking about 10 years ago, the state police didn't want to do it. The option was tell the state police to do it because it's public safety and they're the public safety organization. And if you want something coordinated so that, things like we were talking about the other day, that shooting operation in Northeast Kingdom, where people couldn't talk to each other, is a classic example of why it ought to be a statewide function, or at least, have standards of interoperability and so on.
Yeah.
And the great way to do it, state police has facilities, they ran them until they closed down, to save money, they closed
Save
down
money, yeah.
after their operation, and that was
Yeah.
mistake number one, that put them on a path that now we've got this mess.
And I think,
I agree. I agree completely. My question is why VSP versus the E911 board? So I kind of like the E911 board for setting these standards if the VSP doesn't want to do it, but do you see a reason why VSP over E911?
Well, for the whole reason that you look at boards generally, boards are good at looking at something and saying, is that okay? But boards aren't particularly good at doing things where you have an organization that meets once a month and you know, and a bunch of people who this isn't their job, really. And
And in a lot of that, I mean, I'm on the BSAC board and I'm still trying to find something to do. But it's leadership. There's leadership really educates the board, really expects them to do something and to know what they're doing. But, you know, if we did it to the state police, it all comes down to money. If we tell the state police, you are going to do it, they're gonna say, fine, we're gonna need $50 million a year more to hire, and they can't hire troopers to patrol the highways, never mind.
But if we have a dispatch situation, you know, whoever's in charge of dispatch, depending on their personnel policy, have the same problem. And, you know, and hiring somebody else to do it is not gonna relieve that problem of a shortage of personnel. Clearly, you have to solve the training problem, the recruitment problem, and so on. So it's all part and parcel of everything we're talking about.
I think it's easier to get recruited to dispatch for your local, you know, you're going down to your town hall, you're dispatching your volunteer fire department. There's something very Vermont about that. Becoming a state employee and having to drive to Williston is different. I don't know. I mean, we'll talk. I'll see if I can. But it was money. I was here and it was Bellops. We closed down the PSAPs and there was a lot of concern, especially the one in Rutland. And, you know, being told, oh, no, we can handle it all from, you know, the ones we've got left. And
the way it seemed like the ones that got closed were the better of the bunch.
but now, you know, you've got the folks, they aren't, some of them I think are still getting dispatched out of other places further away. And you've got this whole town, I think the state police are the police for a good portion of the state. So if they want to dispatch police, the fire and ambulance is local.
So
You know,
is that a reason to go E911 since it's not just police we're talking about? I don't know.
well, E911 runs, that's their PSAPs. I mean, they get those calls. But to dismantle the town systems and.
I'm not saying E911 should
No.
run the whole system, but maybe they can set the standards. You empower them and give them money to set those standards that gradually have to come
Yeah.
online.
I think the towns know municipal union districts. They've got solid waste districts. They've got CUDs now. They have local control to say, okay, you have local control. Maybe we say you will have a board and the board will set the budget. And so towns that are getting assessed through that board, the state says we have to do it. Something, you know, we can set a standard. And then if we want more, if we want you to upgrade all your equipment, then we need to be willing to put our money where our mouth is to help with those upgrades. Or if we want you to take on 5 additional towns, you know, we'll do a cost benefit. I mean, if there's only 22 people in those towns, you're gonna make enough money to pay for the gas to get your truck out there. And see where it goes. Okay. We're off. Anyway, these are the maps. This is the state police. This is where law gets dispatched. This is where emergency services get dispatched. And this is where fire gets dispatched. And it seems, she seems to have these different colors. But if we could get fire and emergency services all dispatched from the same place, that would be big progress. or places, but that those, because there's fire, but then EMS is all different. I'm just looking at my county. Because police, most towns don't have their own police department. I know where I can speak. Unless they hire a constable, or they have a constable. But state police does the dispatching. And then we've got the sheriffs who seem to do a lot of dispatching for other things.
Some do, some don't.
Some do, some don't, but if they do, it's under a contract with the state, which they cannot just say, sorry. And it is signed probably by county government, because sheriffs get elected and it can't be up to the whim of an incoming sheriff if he's gonna do this.
Well, actually, they can, because sheriff's departments sign contracts, and theoretically, the contract is passed on to the new sheriff because it belongs to the department.
Right.
But I know of a situation where that hasn't worked.
No. And so we've got to make sure that that doesn't happen, that there's a structure that says you're contracting at least for the next 5 years or 10 years or whatever, with this state board to provide emergency services in these towns. And alterations in this contract have to be moved by the boards, the towns, and whatever. But that you get it done.
Well, we can't tell the sheriffs what to do, because they're independent of elected.
We
And
can
they're,
set the terms of the contract that they sign with us, which says the contract goes on beyond this sheriff.
And that it does typically now, because they make a contract with the sheriff's department, not with the sheriff as an individual office holder. So the contracts are with the organization.
You start violating contracts, you're in big trouble.
But, you still have a problem. I could see the two sheriff's departments right now where you've had changes of leadership where a lot of their contracts have gone by the wayside or have problems.
Yeah. And that's where backup will be important. Who's going to take over those calls while this new sheriff has to be convinced
If
that
some
he has
department just doesn't do it or drops the ball, and so.
or town can do that. I mean, the town,
Is there any failover?
yeah,
What happens to 911 calls?
it's got to be a
Some
contract.
sheriff's
There's
office
got to
goes
be a
down.
clear system as to how you get out of that contract. And part of that is that there is a backup system in place when you do.
So there's the electronic backup and then there's the people backup, and sheriffs
That's
are
another.
uniquely, they're given the unique authority to act on their whims. That's who they are.
Well, they're working on constitutional amendments.
Sure.
So, but that's fine. But if, a sheriff buys a cruiser, you can't just say, I'm gone, we're not paying off the last of the debt on the cruiser. They won't sell you another.
I'm moving to Tennessee, so it doesn't matter.
It's true.
I need a car to get there.
Yeah.
And I can go as fast as I want when I'm driving the cruiser. All right, I think that's it for today. I'm glad I have feeling some backup going in there. But I'm really just trying to get my mind around all of this. And, some of you, I have some experience in local government and know what'll push the buttons.
Well, the one thing about is creating this board or whatever to spend the summer study. I hope it's not the same group we had doing this thing because, you know, you see where we are.
Well, I think that's part of, some groups seem to like studies. The Health and Welfare Committee loves studies. I've worked under several chairs and we study everything. If you don't know what to do, one way to kick the can down the road is have another study. And I'm afraid that's what's going on with the whole school facilities construction PCB testing. I mean, they didn't want to do anything last year until they got the facilities report. And we got the testing. Well, now they're gonna pay the whole freight for the 3 towns who tested and stop testing anybody else, so we don't owe anybody else. My experience, lawsuits with children that get sick are very expensive, and I just soon not do that. We're gonna require kids to be there. We've gotta make sure it's safe, so. And then we figure out how to do it.
Tim Ash said studies are for losers.
Tim Ashwood said that.
But they get the right people around the table and sometimes it opens up
Yeah.
to people.
But they are often a study as a movie prize. I can tell you, I have initiated many studies in my years.
Keeps the conversation.
The way studies work is when you lock the room and don't let them out. When they come out, the result is solid.
Like jury duty.
Exactly. You gotta solve
We're
the
all gonna
problem before you
agree
take
one
it out.
way or the other. Yeah, I mean, that's, you can study something forever, so. Okay, so I will, let you know how I make out tomorrow morning.
We get to.
I'm gonna meet at pro tem with, I think, Senator Kitchell and Senator Hardy, since we're the chairs of the committees.
Is this the meeting at 2 something?
No, this is 10:15. Is there another meeting at 2 something?
No, there was gonna maybe be, so I'll be joining, you won't be alone.
You will. I missed that.
Ashley sent me a note, it says a 10:15 meeting.
I did. All right.
That's. I'll bring a fire extinguisher and just sit quietly in the corner.
We deal with the towers and stuff, right?
Oh, maybe that's,
I don't
we
know.
aren't even talking about putting up
All I
towers.
said was yes to an invitation.
All right,
They're used towers.
yeah. Okay, yeah, Randy, you can't go to any meetings because then there won't be a quorum.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if there is, if Keisha's not able to join us tomorrow. But I did tell Allison, when I got the notice, I said, can I go? And she said I could, so. I can't plan, I think I've got 3 meetings at lunch.
I got 1 or 2. Tomorrow.
Yeah. I mean, it's, I got one this morning, wanted to know if they could meet with me at noon. And I got to follow, it came in like at 11 o'clock. I said, I'm sorry, but I was with the ethics committee this morning. Please send me the information you want to go over with me, but my free time is,
It's not.
it's not.
Absolutely not. I had 2